Jaron Jarvis Channel, Top 20 Scary Stories of the Day from Reddit nosleep. 2018-08-22. Story 1, Cheeseburger, Reuben, cheesy fries, spinach dip, chicken wings, mozzarella sticks. What was your teenage dream job? Not your dream job, with a salary and a 401k, but the one you wanted as a teenager? Mine was pizza delivery driver. I've always enjoyed the solitary act of driving, no matter how short the drive, and pride myself on not having to rely on a GPS. I didn't get an opportunity to realize my teenage dream until I was a junior in college. The college I went to was a mid-size university in a tiny Appalachian town. Starting my junior year, I was allowed to have a car on campus, and I knew the first thing I would do would be to quit my dining hall career and find a new one delivering pizzas. Sadly, there were only a couple of pizza places in town, and the driving jobs there were fairly competitive. I settled for a position at a bar that was just starting to roll out a food delivery service. I was the only driver and worked virtually every day. The bar hoped to break into the small but competitive delivery market by delivering to locations other places wouldn't. The town may have been tiny, but the county and townships surrounding it were expansive, little homes and hamlets spread all across the hills and connected by only county roads. My dream job was everything I hoped it to be. A few months in, however, I received a peculiar call near close. "Are you delivering at this late hour?" A man's voice on the other end of the line asked. Truth was, we weren't. The bar stayed open until 2 a.m. but delivery services were supposed to cease at 11:30. It was 11:40 now. Still, I felt like I could use one more drive to listen to some music before I packed it in for the night. I told the caller that we were still delivering. Excellent. I would like one cheeseburger with extra ketchup and extra mayo. One Reuben sandwich. One order cheesy fries. Spinach dip. An order of chicken wings, extra crispy and extra hot. And 3 orders of mozzarella sticks. I knew the kitchen would be annoyed at having to cobble all that together, especially after I was supposed to be done for the night, but I also relished the idea of the tip that massive order would incur. The man on the line gave me an address and hung up. Once the order was ready, I grabbed the mass of food, which had been divvied up into 3 plastic bags, and got into my car. I punched the address the man had given me into my phone and was delighted to see it was close to 25 minutes away. He might be annoyed that his food would be lukewarm, but at least I would get to roll the window down, feel the evening mountain breeze, and listen to some Avett Brothers. The town's sparse light shriveled in my Civic's rearview mirror, and soon I was on the familiar county back roads. It was brutally, beautifully dark. I sped on. After 20 minutes or so, my GPS indicated that I was about to arrive. The darkness and the surrounding woods were still thick, but I saw a glimmer of light just ahead. The light was coming from streetlights in a tiny parking lot in front of a building that looked like a small office plaza. As I entered the lot, my headlights revealed a sign that read Appalachian Hospice. This confused me. The man on the phone didn't sound elderly or infirm. Perhaps he was part of a family paying a late-night visit to a grandparent, or maybe even an orderly just starting his shift. The former was more likely, as he had provided me with a room number. I parked in the lot, close to the front. Mine was the only car visible. I made my way to the front entrance. The air outside was humid and crisp. I was expecting an intercom system, but all I saw was a single glass door leading to a dimly lit room, the outline of a desk behind it. I regretted not jotting the man's number down or saving it into my phone. I knew the front door was likely locked, but I gave it a pull anyway. To my surprise, it opened and I entered the facility. I had been lucky enough at this point in my life to have never entered a hospice. This was my first time, and I was immediately struck by how oppressive it seemed. The air was warm and stale. The lights were dim because it was after hours, but I got the sense that it wouldn't feel much more welcome in the daytime anyway. It appeared to be a reasonably well cared for place, but the specter of death inside was unmistakable. Light sweat began to trickle down the back of my neck. No one was there to greet me at the door. The guard or receptionist's station was empty, though the computer monitor inside it was on. There were hallways on either side of me. I chose the one that I thought was more likely to have room 12 and made my way down it. As soon as I crossed the threshold into the hallway, the noises began. Crackling moans and whimpers made their way to my ears. It wasn't the moan of someone in pain but the moan of someone, I don't know, worried. Still, I continued on. I had food to deliver and a tip to collect. The crying crescendoed as I neared room 9. The doors of the other rooms had all been closed but I could see that this one was open. Despite my fear and discomfort, the logical part of me knew this was nothing paranormal. This was a place where people came to die. Arguably these moans of despair were the most normal thing imaginable given the circumstances. That didn't mean the noise didn't frighten me. My curiosity was stronger than my fear though, and I took a peek inside the room. I covered my mouth, knowing it wouldn't save me from anything contagious. There was an impossibly withered, wasting, frail old man lying on a plain gurney. His eyes were shut tightly and his little hands gently clasped a blanket just under his chin. His face and fingers looked taut and strained and she was shivering. This is normal, I reminded myself. This is what dying is. And he's in the right place to do it. I couldn't help but be unsettled by the lack of healthcare professionals I had seen thus far though. I was only 3 doors away from my destination. I decided that I would deliver the food and then on the way out would head down the other hallway and notify a doctor that a patient was in distress. A few big strides later I had finally reached room 12. Like 9, this one was open. I cautiously took a look inside and did not see anyone. There was an empty gurney before me but it looked like someone had been there moments before. The sheets were a mess and there were used tissues on the bedside table next to it, scattered haphazardly around framed photos from loved ones and cards from well-wishers. Had the man moved to another room? Gone to the bathroom? I was then startled by a familiar, now booming voice. "Is that you, my friend? Is that food?" the voice asked. It was coming from behind a sheet situated next to the first gurney. "Yes," I stammered and entered the room. I maneuvered beyond the curtain and was finally met with the source of the voice on the phone. At the sight of him I tried to stifle a gasp. The man was huge. Absolutely huge. Beyond massive. He looked to be conservatively 500 pounds and I would wager even more. He was dressed in what appeared to be teal scrubs but rolls of his flesh spilled out from under the shirt and beyond the drawstring pants and over the sides of the gurney, like an ice cream sandwich melting through its wrapper on a hot summer day. I don't mean to body shame. I'm a rather large man myself, but I had never come close to seeing something like this. "I'm very happy you're here, friend. I'm very hungry," the man said. Despite his size, the man's voice was not pitched as one would expect from the fat surely encroaching on his voice box and diaphragm. If anything, his voice was deep, assured, suave, even. "Yes," I managed to say and placed the bags of food on a nearby chair. I began the ritual of pulling each to-go carrier out and revealing what was inside so he knew the full order had arrived. Cheeseburger, Reuben, cheesy fries, spinach dip, chicken wings, 3 orders of mozzarella sticks. It was all there. "Excellent. Just wonderful," the man exclaimed with a little more energy than I was expecting. He was sitting up in bed now, as much as he could anyway, and beaming. "I will provide you with payment in a moment, but first please pass me that cheeseburger. I simply must eat right now. I've already eaten once tonight but the meal was dissatisfactory. I was so happy to hear you were open at such a late hour." I handed over the burger, starting to feel deeply uncomfortable. Now that my shock at seeing the size of the man had subsided, I started to notice some other disquieting features about him. I knew that obesity was a problem in this part of the country, but aside from the man's size he displayed no other signs of coming from one of the poorer areas in the county. His accent was refined, almost posh. Aside from the obvious, he looked well cared for. His black hair was neat and tidy. His skin was smooth. There were no blemishes, no acne, no visible stretch marks that I could see. He seemed new. I also couldn't help but notice that he didn't appear to be hooked up to any of the darkened machines around him, no breathing tube or anything that indicated he might be a patient. And while the bed of his presumed roommate next to him had flowers, photos, and cards from family members adorning it. There was nothing on the large man's side of the room. Just his massive frame on his small bed that was beautiful. Please tell the chef that he knows exactly what extra mayonnaise and extra ketchup means, he said. There were bits of crimson sauce and rare meat smeared across his pristine, pale face. He looked like a corpulent vampire. The spinach dip now, if you will. I passed over the circular container. He popped it open and poured the dull green contents into his mouth like soft serve filling a waffle cone, finishing the appetizer in 10 seconds, maybe less. Then he mashed the pita bread triangles together and swallowed them too. The Reuben, my friend. Please. Don't worry. I promise I will pay you. I'm just, very hungry. Famished. Absolutely starving, do you understand? My most recent meal was woefully insufficient. I passed the Reuben to him as well and soon he had devoured that as well. I knew at the rate that he was now eating, it would all be gone soon and elected to bring him the cheesy fries before he could ask. Yes, excellent. These are exactly what I wanted next. What are these little bits here? Bacon. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Would you like a bite, my friend? He said I'm okay, I said. I couldn't imagine ever feeling hungry again. Do you think your roommate will want any food? Where is he? The man laughed, a deep, throaty bark. I don't imagine he would, no. I offer a share of this feast to you because I can see that you are also the kind of person who is hungry, he said, snarling and wheezing through bits of fried potato. I definitely look like I don't skip any meals. Normally I wouldn't like having that pointed out, but at this specific, unsettling moment I didn't have the mental bandwidth to be offended by his assumed camaraderie. Oh, I don't mean to be rude. I just want you to understand that there is nothing shameful about appetite. Nothing, he shouted, his cheeks gaining a ruby tint, beads of sweat jumping from his forehead. I physically recoiled at his change in tone. He did not seem to care though. He held out his massive hand, clearly expecting more food. I piled the mozzarella stick boxes and handed them over, keeping my body as far away as possible. Ah yes. Fried perfectly. Wonderful. No, what I mean is, my friend, is that I suspect people have told you all your life to watch what you eat. I know they used to with me. Used to. But they don't do that anymore. Because once you know the truth, you'll never conform to their impotent shaming tactics again. He tore apart the breaded sticks as he spoke, marveling at the cheesy contents within. He shoved the remaining mush into his mouth 3 at a time in between his words. At the conclusion of his statement opened up the tiny containers of marinara and downed them like shots of liquor. The truth? I squeaked, as I handed over the chicken wings that we are here to consume. We are born empty and every moment we spend not filling ourselves is a moment wasted. Listen to your appetites, my friend, listen to the hunger. Eat. Consume. Eat. Consume. Eat again. And again. Eat whatever you want. I was silent. I had no more food to give him. Well, looks like I've consumed close to enough for now, he laughed, his beaming face covered in discolored food sludge. He really did look like the happiest man in the world. What do I owe you, friend? $68.70, I said. The man reached down to his bedside table, again with uncommon grace, opened the drawer and pulled out a single, immaculate $100 bill. Here you go, my son. You can keep the change. Promise me that you'll follow your hunger. Yes. Thank you. I will. Have a good night, I said. I accepted the money and backed away until I was behind the man's curtain. He kept his large, watery eyes on me, smiling the whole time. As I exited the room, I could have sworn I saw small red stains on the empty, disheveled bed by the door. I was shell-shocked and disturbed as I made my way back down the hallway. I wanted to get back to my car and then back to the dishes awaiting me at the restaurant as soon as possible. I had all but forgotten the whimpering man in room 9, but when I neared the door I suddenly remembered my internal promise to check back in on him. I peered into the room and felt my guts plummet. The frail old man was on his side now, facing the door, his arms crisscrossed around his shoulders and his milky eyes wide open in absolute terror. He did not seem to register that I was in his doorframe. He whispered aloud to no one in particular, voice trembling, "It is hungry. It is hungry. It is hungry." Story 2, my Fitbit may be showing me something about myself I don't want to know. Edited for length. I need help, and I'm hoping after you get past the initial eye-rolling you have advice. I'll just say it, I have a Fitbit and I'm one of those people. But now, things are getting weird. I got a Versa model Fitbit as a gift about a month ago, and things were fine at first. I quickly turned into one of the annoying people constantly bragging about how many steps they are at or running in place to get more. It was the beginning of a rough period in my life. I was always exhausted and couldn't focus. So if all I accomplished in an hour was getting my 250 steps in, that was success. Anyway, after the first week I noticed something weird. I checked the Fitbit iOS app over coffee one morning and realized I already had 7,000 steps in for the day. Impossible, I had only walked downstairs to get breakfast since waking up. That would be 50 steps, maybe 100 max in my small townhouse. I always figured watches like this weren't dead accurate, but to be that far off, especially considering how expensive it is. I blew it off that first time, just thinking it was a fluke that would mess up my averages for the day. Who cares? About 2 weeks later I opened up the app again and scrolled through my stats to see my step averages surprisingly high. Also, my average heart rate is pretty high, but I'm fairly fit and work out, so that's weird. I noticed that a total of 5 days I had a ton of steps. On days I didn't exert extra effort. I pulled up the hourly breakdown of steps, and noticed on those days, I must have been running from the hours of midnight to 4 a.m. TF. I am not a morning person, so I was definitely asleep during those times. I had been a little extra sore that week, so I figured I must have been working out too hard during the day. Finally, this past week I laid off working out to see if I feel any better. I wake up almost daily now with scratches and bruises, feeling physically exhausted and sore with some crazy amount of steps. I tried pulling 2 all-nighters and nothing weird seemed to happen. I laid off drinking, nothing changed. This morning, I woke up with 10,000 steps, covered in blood. I have woken up with blood on me once before, figuring I just had a nosebleed in my sleep. Now I'm not so sure. I am completely panicked. I'm a nice person, I keep to myself. I'm not aggressive or violent. I don't have enemies that I know of. What is going on? I'm connecting my watch to my phone's chips and setting it to track my workout to see where I went, and I will revisit those locations in the morning. I'm not sure what I could find. Who I could find. What will my Fitbit show me about myself I don't want to know? Story 3, my grandparents told me it's the cat that knocks. My grandparents went on a cruise and asked me to look after the house and their cat Mr. Whiskers. They always paid me a decent amount for doing anything, so something of this scale was bound to pay out. I gladly accepted. When my grandparents were running through the rest of the things I needed to do, my grandma mentioned, "If you hear knocking at night, it's just the kitty running through the halls or trying to get into a room. He usually just slaps the door. Don't worry, he won't do it for long before he gives up and goes back to sleep." I've heard the cat knock on the doors in the past when I was in the bathroom, but I have never seen it. I made sure to make a mental note to not freak out when trying to fall asleep. The day started out perfect. I brought my PC over, played games and caught up on all my favorite shows. My grandparents left food money that they always let me keep in addition to the payment for whatever task they asked me to do. I ordered pizza and sat down to finish a show I had started prior to ordering. I heard 3 slight taps and a scratching noise. I got up to see the kitty sitting in front of the laundry room door. He always wanted in there to drink from the sink that had a slight drip to it. I opened the door for him. He rushed in and jumped right onto the sink countertop and started lapping at the water. I stepped out of the room. The sound of faint knocking came from behind. I turned around to see if the cat was hitting the sink, but his back was arched and hair was on end looking directly at me. The soft thudding continuing. Heat rushed to my face and gut, my back tingling with the feeling of fear. I backed slowly out of the room to hear the pizza delivery guy pull up. I ran to the front door and opened it before he even had the chance to get out. Just glad to have someone in the general vicinity. "Yo, pepperoni pizza? Yeah, how much?" I did a quick look behind me. $12. I handed him 15 and told him to keep the rest. "Thank you." He paused, looking behind me for a split second. "Hey, I'm not into cosplay and whatnot, but that was just awesome." From the front door is a long hallway with 2 open spaces right when you walk in. Left is living room, right is kitchen. Directly in front is the hallway with the laundry room on the left before ending in a T that has bedrooms on each side. I turned around, my eyes darting from right to left. I turned back and he was already leaving. He shouted out, "Hope you two enjoy the pizza." I grabbed my grandpa's old bat he always keeps near the front door and walked slowly down the hall, eyes swishing back and forth. I make it to the laundry room and the cat wasn't there. The dripping of the water made it even worse as I continued down the hall to the T. I looked both ways, finding one door shut and another ajar. The left one was slightly cracked, so I went for that one first. I reached out with my left hand, the bat ready in the other. I put my hand on the door and pushed. I ran into the room screaming, expecting someone to be here and throw them off with randomness. Nothing. Thud. 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 From across the hall in my grandparents' room. I did one final check and proceeded to the next room. I called out for Mr. Whiskers, hoping the cat would reveal itself walking down the hall or release a meow so I knew if it was him in the room or something I should be afraid of. I tapped on the door with the bat and was returned with light padded thuds. Returning this time, I opened the door to find the cat sitting there. It looked up at me, then behind me. The cat jumped back, howling in fear, scrambling, trying to get away from whatever it saw. I turned around and understood immediately. A form of black stood in the cross-section of the hall. Its head hanging low, long wispy black hair hung down around its slender frame, its arms dropping down at its side further than anything humanly possible, with its knuckles touching the ground. The thing whipped its head up, looking directly at me with a painfully crooked smile on its face. Its eyes gone, with nothing but sockets to take their place. I jumped in the bedroom and slammed the door, locking it. I ripped the blanket off the bed and stuffed it at the bottom of the door so it didn't have any way of reaching me. I lay there with my back on the floor, listening as the thing lumbered to the door, its arms dragging, sounding like sandpaper dragging across the floor. It stopped just outside of the door. Silence. Then 3 little knocks came from the other side of the door. Story 4, Missing Girl and the Doll Village of the Woods. I grew up in a small town located next to a huge state park, my backyard bordering the woods. The park was pretty much a swamp and nobody really went adventuring there. There were no trails and the only structure was a place called the Doll Village. It was a series of small houses, about 3 feet tall, made of concrete. Legend has it a man went crazy and built the houses for his dolls who had lives of their own. But the official story is it used to be a tourist attraction in the 1920s. I was 19 and getting ready to move off to college. It was my last summer, when the news struck. A little girl had gone missing in the woods. Being a small town where everyone knew everyone, the whole community was devastated. The neighborhood began a town-wide search party. Every day for hours on end we would scour the woods looking for her. After 2 weeks, with no luck, the search was called off. On a whim though, one guy went off to find the doll village. Sure enough, inside he found a small doll that had looked like it had just come off a store shelf yesterday. The doll bore a striking resemblance to the missing girl. The mother claimed she never bought the doll and didn't know where it came from, but was certain it belonged to her daughter. We searched that area for a few more hours, but again with no luck, returned to our homes. 2 nights later, the girl's mom was banging on our door. She claimed the doll was speaking to her in her daughter's voice. Her favorite toys would be found in the room the doll was in, and the mother had been going house to house frantically trying to find someone to believe her. Everyone thought she was going through post-traumatic stress and was imagining things. The only person who seemed to believe her story was Old Man Stevens, an alcoholic whose son had gone missing in the woods back in the 1950s. He claimed his son returned to his doorstep months later in the form of a doll. But the old man was known for his conspiracies and absurd claims. He was a lonely guy and most of the neighborhood was upset with him over this, thinking he was using her grief to seek attention and egging her on with his story. When asked about this doll he found, he said the doll tried to lure him into the woods one day, but he didn't follow. It never came back. Now, the girl had often liked to come over and play in my childhood swing set in the backyard. One afternoon, while I was packing my car to go off to college, I heard the creaking of metal coming from the backyard. I walked through the driveway to find the doll swinging on the set. My stomach dropped. Did the woman come over and do this to frighten us, so we would believe her story? Was the doll alive? I took the doll and walked over to her house. I banged on the door and she answered. Behind her I could see the entire house had been torn apart. She said the doll went missing and she was frantically searching everywhere for it. I told her I found it on the swing set, and now I was convinced there might be something more to her story. Days later my mother stormed into my room angrily. She said the woman was coming over harassing us over my story. I swore up and down I wasn't trying to screw with the lady, and told her about the swing set. Mom didn't buy it. A few weeks later, I was Skyping my parents from my dorm when they said the woman had gone missing. It was believed she had gone into the woods again to search for her daughter. A small search party had gotten together, and the first place they thought to go was the doll village. Sure enough, inside one of the concrete houses, was the little girl's doll, next to a bigger doll that looked just like her mom. The police took the dolls as evidence, and the case was never solved. The last we heard of the story was from Old Man Stevens again. He had been arrested on public intoxication, and claimed while in the cell, could hear the voices of the woman and daughter coming from the evidence room. But, being the crazy old drunk he was, nobody believed him. Story 5, We All Come Back. Grandpa Nick was dying. That was an irrefutable fact. The old man was without a doubt on his deathbed. It was his own fault. The man loved his cheeseburgers and fries, and he avoided fruits and veggies like a petulant 5-year-old. His stomach cancer diagnosis came as no surprise to the rest of the family, and when the disease became inoperable, I remember hanging my head and crying. Grandpa Nick was always such a wonderful grandfather to me. He would take me to baseball games or down to the park to play. He would slip me an extra cookie before dinner, winking and saying it was our little secret. I loved Grandpa Nick, and now he was leaving me. What shocked me even more than the idea of losing Grandpa Nick was the man's reaction to his own mortality. When someone finds out they are going to die, and there is nothing anyone can do to prevent it, their reaction is normally pretty predictable. They cry, or get angry, or try begging a higher power for just a little more time. But not Grandpa Nick. The old man only smiled, nodded his head and said, "Guess it's that time." I couldn't believe it. How could somebody be so flippant about their own death? But he left the hospital with a smile on his face, and that was the last I or the rest of the family heard about it. Day after day went by, and Grandpa Nick never once mentioned his diagnosis to anybody. I assumed he was merely in denial about it, but when I brought this up to my parents, they told me to just leave it alone. This calm denial went on for days, then weeks, then months, and all the while, Grandpa Nick continued taking me to the park or playing games with me. Everything was just business as usual, and it was driving me insane. Grandpa Nick may have been okay with his passing, but I wasn't. I wasn't ready to lose him, and I needed someone to be sad with me. I needed him to be sad. Finally, after beating me in a game of checkers and asking if I wanted to play again, I snapped. I jumped to my feet, tears streaming down my face. "No. I don't want to play again, and I don't want to lose my grandpa," I shouted, unable to keep the sadness bottled up anymore. "Why are you so calm? Don't you care that you're leaving?" I'll never forget what the old man said to me that sunny afternoon. He only smiled up at me, a hysterically sobbing 8-year-old girl, and said, "Sweetie, I'm not going anywhere. I'll come back. We all come back." Now, I didn't know too much of the world as of yet, but I did know that dead people did not come back. It was just a fact of nature, as unarguable as water is wet or the earth moves around the sun. After I finally calmed myself down, I chalked the strange statement up to more denial. But there was one part Grandpa Nick had said that I just couldn't shake. He had said, "We all come back." What did he mean by all? The months went by and the seasons changed, everything going on as it always had, until one night late in autumn, the telephone rang. It was Grandpa Nick's doctor. He told us the old man was at the clinic and only had a few hours left. Before my mother could hang up, he told us something else that shocked me to my core. He said that Grandpa Nick had requested I not be there, his own granddaughter. He had said that I wasn't ready to see something like this. To my horror, my mother and father actually started discussing whether or not he was right, whether or not they should leave me behind. I shrieked at the top of my lungs that I was going to say goodbye to Grandpa Nick even if I had to walk to the hospital. With worry etched onto their faces, they put me in the car, and we left. Anyone who has been at somebody's bedside when they are beginning to pass away will tell you it is a surreal experience. There was the man I had loved and grown up with, laying on that sterile white hospital bed, his eyes closed and his breathing shallow. A strange shadow had fallen over his face, casting a darkness across his eyelids and around his cheeks. Some people will call this the death's head look. I didn't know the term, but I knew what it meant. Grandpa Nick was, without a doubt, dying. 2 hours went by, but I didn't notice. It all felt like one long minute to me until I heard the steady solid beep of the heart rate monitor flatlining. I gripped Grandpa Nick's cold hand and started to sob long and hard. Turning up to look at my parents, I noticed that neither one of them was crying. They only stared down at the lifeless body, like they were waiting for it to get up. I turned around and was about to ask them what was wrong when it happened. The hand I was holding, Grandpa Nick's cold dead hand, started to twitch. I gasped and jumped back, looking at the body with wide eyes still wet with tears. The twitch moved up the arm to the shoulders, then down along the chest and up the neck to the head. When the legs started to go, the twitch had grown into a full-on convulsion. The body bounced and kicked and writhed on the hospital bed, the head lolling back and the dead eyes opening and closing of their own volition. I started hyperventilating, pure terror washing over my tiny frame, but my mom, my dad, even the doctor didn't look the least bit shocked. I would have screamed or run or done anything at all, but I was frozen in horror at the utterly wrong display in front of me. It only got worse. Grandpa Nick's chest started to heave and push up with each convulsion, and with one final enormous shake, I heard a crack. Blood poured out of the old man's chest, and I watched as his ribcage started to open, the ribs rising up and out like giant blood-covered fangs. This time, I did scream. I shrieked at the top of my little lungs until my throat was raw. Still, the ribs expanded, the chest opening like some sort of unholy box. And then, I heard it. A sound I shouldn't have heard in that moment. A sound that simply could not, should not, be. I heard crying. Coming from Grandpa Nick's body. It was the crying of a baby. The doctor approached the blood-splattered husk that used to be my grandfather and reached into the gaping chest cavity. What he pulled out will haunt me until the day I die. It was a baby, a perfectly healthy male baby, covered in blood and screaming like it had just woken up from a nap. I watched as the doctor smiled, and despite the crying of the new child, I heard him whisper, "Welcome back, Nick." That was almost 40 years ago, but I still remember it as vividly as that cold autumn night when it happened. I still wake up screaming in my bed, having dreamt of my grandfather's chest bursting open, and his ribs parting to unveil the unspeakable rebirth. Grandpa Nick is now my cousin, Nicholas. Named after his beloved grandfather, my parents will tell people. But I know the truth. I was there, and this is the only place I can write this where someone somewhere might believe me. Why did I wait 40 years to tell this story? Because now I understand. I know now what Grandpa Nick meant. You see, My father has just been diagnosed with terminal heart failure, and he isn't worried about it at all. Story 6, I hunt Satanists. For the past 12 years, I've hunted Satanists with my father. I was 6 when he first took me out. I was never certain if I even believed in God or Satan, but my father always made sure I knew that the work was important and to not question it. Don't misunderstand me, I don't necessarily have anything against Satanists, it's just that this is how I was raised. My father and I belong to no religion actually, so we don't hate or loathe people because of their religion. We only hunt. By the way, we do follow guidelines to determine who we can kill, we don't just blindly go after all Satanists. Generally, we only get involved when a congregation starts getting into stuff that can threaten the safety of the general population. After the first couple years of doing this, I just stopped asking my father questions since he only ever replied that the work was necessary. Until recent events, I never knew just how important it is. Hunting Satanists is now second nature to me thanks to my dad. We go from town to town, looking for signs of Satanists. Recently, we arrived in Fall River, Massachusetts. We usually have to go back there every couple of years, since it's a pretty active spot. This hunt was supposed to be routine. I don't know how so much shit went down. Every visit started the same. Searching for the altar. It's never in the same spot since we always kill everyone we find there. It took about 2 weeks to find the altar this time. Compared to all the others, this was considerably deeper within the forest. Their altar was made of animal bones fit together to form a throne. Surprisingly, there was no goat head. You'd think with their level of commitment, they'd get their hands on a goat head or at least have pentagrams. There were none of the classic Satanist signs. We decided that the pagans still deserved to die, so we set up a small, discreet camp, and staked out the altar. After a week, the Satanists arrived. I remember immediately feeling something was wrong when I saw them, and I got that sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. The days before, when staked out the place, you could feel a gentle breeze and hear all the insects. But not that night. It was as if nature was holding its breath. The air seemed stale and thin. The absence of ambient sounds made things seem even more unnatural. We should have left, but we were too concentrated on the hunt. When they started their sermon, we set the bear traps. We set all 10 of them, with the majority being on the side towards town. I know, 10 bear traps are excessive, but it makes the actual hunting easier. Once we finished setting up the last one, we headed back to our camp and readied our rifles. I set up on a nearby log, on the side away from the town, and took aim. I counted 8 of them. After a second of deliberation, I decided I wanted to take out the preacher. I like to kill the leader first since, more often than not, the followers shit themselves when they see that their leader isn't as powerful as they believed. While I was preparing the first shot, my father went to the other side to stop anyone running towards town. Our general plan is for me to kill one of the pagans, while on the side away from town, so they are even more motivated to run away towards the town. When my father was set up and hidden from the pagans, he signaled me. I splattered the leader's head all over the followers, in the front row, the very next second. There was a brief pause before the blood-curdling, hysterical, screaming began. The followers bolted. I was happy to see them all run towards town and even happier when they all got caught in the traps. I wasted no time leaving my post. When I approached the first pagan, I nearly threw up. The man's eyes were missing. It wasn't as if they were missing for a while, the sockets were bleeding profusely. And then he had a wicked ear-to-ear smile. Although his state was dumbfounding me, I didn't have time to figure out what happened. I shot him down. The rest of the captured had parts missing as well. Altogether there were missing eyes, a tongue, ears, a nose, facial skin, gums and someone's fucking skull. I'm not even kidding. Their head was like a deflated balloon. I couldn't even believe that it was a real person. I shot the ones who weren't already dead. As I killed the last one, I heard my father's scream. I quickly made my way to him, effortlessly navigating past the traps. When I arrived I nearly lost my mind. My father was dead, and only his head remained. Oh God, the look on his face was unbearable. His face was twisted and full of confusion, and only the whites of his eyes were visible. I remember quickly turning around. There was something at the throne. It had the shape of a human, but you could tell it wasn't. I noticed was body first. It had the same crucifix tattoo my father had on his back. When I recognized it, I was filled with rage. I recall grabbing my rifle and taking aim. My breath, my heart, and my mind were going a mile a minute. I could barely stay on the target. I was about to take the shot, but the creature turned. The shock of its face stopped me dead in my tracks. I actually passed out because the shock was so extreme. I awoke as the morning sun brushed my face. I do remember most of the events that transpired that night. Everything was clear. Except for that thing's face. It was distorted in my memory. All I know for certain was that it radiated evil and should not be looked at by anyone, much less be on this earth. Just trying to think about it is enough to make me vomit and my head turn fuzzy. I'm trying to find my way back to town right now. Unfortunately, my father had the map and compass. With his body gone, I don't think I'll be seeing them anytime soon. Luckily, I have a partial signal on my phone. It was enough to load a map, but the battery is almost dead. If I don't check in again, know that I am most likely dead. I'm writing this because if I don't make it out of here, I need people to know that there's at least one real demon out there. I now know why Father always said that this work was necessary. It is pure evil, and it needs to be killed. Please help. Story 7, she said she was my father's sister. I remember it was autumn. Early autumn, when the sun is still warm and there are still a few yellow leaves clinging to the skeletal tree branches. I remember the footpath covered with brown birch leaves, the pointed ends curling into crusted spirals, the red sun low in the sky, when I passed the gate and saw the woman. I was 9 at the time, 2 months into year 5 in a Surrey primary school, still publicly funded somehow. I wasn't the only black kid in my school, but, as is common in Surrey schools, I was the only black girl in my class. I don't quite know the connection, but for whatever reason that meant that I was the only one to walk home from school by myself. Don't ask me why it works that way, but that's pretty typical. Elijah, the only black boy in Bison class, year 4, also walked home without a parent or older sibling. What's sort of funny about it was that both Elijah and I had the farthest to walk out of all of the children. But, I digress. I remember saying goodbye to Mrs. McAdoo, who was standing on the school field with 5 other children, waiting for their parents. She waved me goodbye with a small, knowing smile, and I hitched my backpack up my shoulders and went on my way. I had made this walk every day after school, around the same time, and I was used to the familiar faces of the parents who would wait behind the school gate. So I immediately noticed the strange woman standing in place, not craning her neck, like the other grown-ups, but calmly staring through the bars. At first, I thought she was pretty, she was quite striking, I remember. But when I had come within a few feet of her, I saw that she wasn't pretty, more like prettiness had once been in reach but had slipped from her grasp like morning fog. The most striking thing, setting her apart from all the other grown-ups, was her long dreadlocks, which were graying around the wiry ends. We had held eye contact since I was within 20 feet of the gate, and now I stood before her, looking up into her onyx-colored eyes. "Cadian," she snapped, in an accent that wasn't Surrey or Cockney, or even Irish like Mrs. McAdoo's. "I'm here to take you home. Come." Hearing it for the second time, I realized it was Caribbean, presumably Jamaican. I frowned. "How do you know my name?" I asked. "Never mind that, child. Come. I will take you home." "I don't need you to walk me home," I insisted. "We don't walk, we take my car." Irritably, she swiveled around and gestured to a sedan double parked next to the school's driveway. "Come," she insisted, reaching for my hand. I let her touch me but then jerked my arm away. "I don't need a drive," I persisted, putting one hand on my hip and shifting my weight to that leg. "And I don't need a grown-up, I've been walking home by myself since last winter in year 4. "Insolent child," she said. Her tone was much sharper than the volume of her voice or the expression on her face. What struck me was how she never seemed to yell or get angry. Her face stayed dead, a mirthless smirk on her lips, only the color of her eyes waxed hot and cold. Only her tone was corrosive. "How do you know me?" I asked after a beat. She seemed to laugh, though neither her expression nor body language altered. "Come with me, girl. I want to know how you know me. You ask a lot of questions," she said with the faintest hint of amusement. "If you can be amused without a sense of humor, just one," I corrected. She sighed audibly, though her face stayed the same. She then reached inside her coat, or what I would later learn was called a shawl. It was multicolored and layered with different, draping fabrics. It reminded me of the ponchos I had seen in those old cowboy movies. Her hand was in there a while, rummaging around, and I remember her looking at me like she was trying to make a decision. I then remember she produced a cigarette. She put it to her lips and lit it, her knotted, brown knuckles and long skeletal fingers shielding the lighter's flame. "You can smoke this close to the school," I nagged, knowing how irksome I sounded. "Hush, girl." She bit, the unlit cig bobbing up and down in her lips. Once lit, she held the cigarette between her long bony fingers. She then blew the smoke out her mouth, the fat white wave speared by two long streams from her nostrils, forming a gaseous white dove. "I know more than your name, girl," she said with that venomous tone. "I know you was born in Croydon, on the East End. I know your mother is Miss Farah Bryce, your father Mr. Greg Bryce." I felt frightened then. This was all correct. How did I know this woman? Or more apropos, how did she know me? "I'm not supposed to go with strangers," I said to her, a small swelling of pride for remembering what my head teacher and Mrs. McAdoo had told me 1,000 times. To this, the woman gave another mirthless chuckle, but this time I saw a flash of pain in her face as she did it. "I'm no stranger, girl," she said quite deliberately. "I know you. But I don't know you." The woman took another puff from the cigarette held between her claw-like fingers and looked around us. It was only then that I realized all the other parents had left, leaving only the two of us, and the dead leaves, swirling across the footpath, crackling like crumpled paper. I looked behind me and saw the deputy head teacher, Mr. Bedden, at the school entrance, talking to a parent. "You don't need to know me," I heard the woman say. "I'm your kin." "What's that?" "I'm your family." "Yeah? How's that?" She puffed again, the smoke blowing out her nose like it would from a dragon's. "I'm your father's sister." "Really? You're my father's sister?" I said I was. "So you're my aunt? What you think? How come my father's never mentions you?" She gave that laugh a second time, this time the pain was more evident in her face. "You don't believe me?" she asked softly. "No," I said hurriedly, worried I was being rude. "I believe you." She took a long pull off her smoke, the exhaust seeping in thin wisps from her bottom lip up to and across her half-masked eyes. She seemed to be sizing me up, her dark pupils cold. "You like school?" she asked. Her voice had completely changed. "Yes," I said. "I love school. What you learn." I then rambled on about how Mrs. McAdoo had been teaching us about the ancient Aztecs for history, and how we were also learning about all the creation myths from the Native Americans, and how we had made a volcano in science class using plaster and pudding, and how we learned how to sing every other week, and how we were learning how to put on a Latin dance concert in PE and, etc., etc. She listened, her eyes color still cool, without interrupting me. She just listened and puffed away. I don't remember how long I had ranted on about what I'd learned in school, but I'm sure you can imagine, me being a little kid and a bit of a teacher's pet. Her cigarette was now a short, smoldering stub between her yellowed fingertips. "Tell me about your mother," she said. "You take care of her?" "Yes," I said, nodding my head feverishly, my braided hair swinging, the plastic beads clicking together. "I take out the garbage every night after supper. My older sister, Kayla, she does the dishes. My baby sister, Anne Mary, she don't do any choirs 'cause she's just a baby." See? There was no chuckle then. Just that flash of pain. It soon vanished and she gave me that humorless smirk from before as she dropped the butt of her cigarette to the ground and stubbed it out with a sandal toe. "Okay, child," she said, a hint of hurry in her voice. "Come to the car. Your father asked me pick you up." To this, I froze. I felt my skin prickle. My father was in Paris on a business trip. He'd been in Paris since last Friday. There was no way he had called this woman. "I don't think so," I said. "I can walk by myself." She looked at me with that dead expression for what felt like an hour. Then, I could not say after how long, she turned a little, still facing me, and began to walk away. "Maybe you worth leaving," she said. And she put her back to me and went to her car. At the time, I had no idea what she meant by that. I watched her walk away, then get into her car. After getting in, she seemed to sit there for a while, though I could not see what she was doing from the dark-tinted windows. "Everything all right, Cadian?" I heard a familiar voice behind me. Turning around, I saw it was Mr. Bedden, standing at the entrance gate. "Yes, Mr. Bedden," I said automatically, as children do. I then heard the sound of an engine growling to life. When I turned in the direction the sound came from, the woman's blue car was gone. I waited a little longer, chatting with the deputy head teacher before walking home without ever stopping for anything. Like a reoccurring nightmare, I kept thinking about my encounter with the woman on the walk home. Though in earnest, I wanted to forget. It wasn't so much I wanted to forget, as much as, I just wish I hadn't seen her. I know it might seem like a very innocuous, albeit unsettling, encounter, but I walked away feeling dirty, violated. Like I had done something wrong but couldn't explain what it was and thus couldn't be forgiven. When I got home I felt some compulsion to tell my mother. Not really a compulsion, more like that's what my head was dragging me to do despite the dead weight in my stomach. Our flat was on top of a pub, across from a McDonald's restaurant. Some days the crowds beneath us were tipsy and benign. Some days they were neither of those things. On Fridays they'd be right pissed and rowdy. It was a little after 3 when I got to the steps with my keys, so the pub was only filled with doughy, grey-bearded white men in their denim and their flannel. Always they'd be peering out at me through the window for hardly a second before returning to their pints, like I was a sparrow passing by. When I opened the front door, I was greeted by Anne Mary's screeching and Kayla's arguing over my mother's bludgeoning retorts. "But it ain't fair, that." Kayla wailed. "Right, you best shut up now 'fore I lose my temper." Mom bellowed. "But hush up, you're upsetting the baby." Once I'd hung up my coat and kicked off my shoes, I made my way to the kitchen where the sound was coming from. I just caught Kayla storming to the couch and sitting down emphatically, her arms round across her chest. Mother was standing by the stove, an opaque steam hovering beside her. Baby Anne Mary howled wetly in her arms while she rocked her furiously. "Hello." I squeaked. Mother's hunting eyes found me before the sound of my voice could travel. "Cadian," she snapped. "Right, what's that garbage doing in the bin still filled up, hey? You were supposed to take that out on the way to school." Anne Mary gurgled for a moment then resumed wailing. "I'd do the same at the sound Mother's thunder. But today, I forgot," was all I said, my face blank. "Well, you ain't forgot just now what I said, yeah?" My mother looked at me dead in the face. "Me lovely, tie up that bag, yeah? And take it out." I didn't argue. I didn't even say yes, Mom, like I was ought. I just went along and did it without thinking. I didn't even remember doing it after it was done. Behind me, my mother and Kayla resumed their fighting, Kayla begging to be allowed to go to a sleepover, at a house that included boys. I do remember that day that I felt an intense dislike for my mother. A hatred, in fact. I thought about how she'd never told me about my aunt and how she had never invited her to see me or Kayla. She must be doing that against father's wishes, I had thought. She was his sister, not mother's. I thought about how I really hated my mother, in a way I had never felt before, for being so stubborn. No wonder she's so prickly. I thought then about the woman. She's never been let to see me. I felt very sorry for the women then and wanted to again see her. There wasn't really time to tell my mother about what happened. She had to keep an eye on Anne Mary and kept getting calls from her work. She was on maternity leave from the hospital, but the ladies who took over for her could never remember what from what. And either way, I didn't want to tell her. After all, it was Father's sister. I'd just wait for him to come back from his business trip to tell him the story. I remember the week was boring for a few days. Nothing too special at school or at home. Nothing except news that Father was coming home early from his business trip. I only found out about it from Kayla the day I had come home and she was the only one there. Mother had taken Anne Mary with her to meet Father somewhere. I didn't understand this. Why wouldn't Mother just wait for Father at home? Kayla couldn't tell me because she hadn't paid attention or probably just wasn't told. Anyway, we took advantage of having the flat to ourselves. Daytime TV, music blaring in our room, crisps, soda and chocolate chip cookies for dinner. At the time I didn't make the connection. How could I? It wasn't until dark out that my sister and I heard the front door lock jiggling open, then the slow swish of the door across the carpet. Instinctively, Kayla and I walked over to the hallway to see them better and watch them take off their coats and shoes. My father was wearing his suit, the shoulders unrealistically pointed, his shirt collar withered around his neck, the tie undone and hanging in two. My mom stood beside him, one arm across his back, the hand gentling his shoulder, the other cradling Anne Mary. As though content in the confirmation it was they, Kayla walked away from the hall and back to her phone on the couch. I stayed, watching my father's slow movement, his face more drawn and haggard than I'd ever seen him. He walked in step with my mother as though they were both in a trance. Both grown-ups, giants beside me, took no notice of my presence. Before I spoke up in a little voice, "Father, I saw your sister." Father stopped. His expression was still the same, like he was asleep with eyes open. But then he looked down at me. "What?" he said. "I met my aunt. Your sister." "What are you on about?" he said in a hoarse voice, his brow furrowing. "I met your sister, she came to school last week on Thursday." My father just stared at me with his red-tinted, yellow eyes. "Cadian," he deliberated. "What the blazes are you on about?" "Your sister," I said sharply. She was a tall woman with dreadlocks. She spoke in an accent, I think it was Jamaican or something, and she said she was your sister. There was a pause. My father's eyes didn't blink for what felt like a full minute. Then they grew, then shrank, then turned to water. He put his large hands over his face. There was no sound. He stayed still that way like a weeping statue, except for his heaving shoulders. My mother tightened her arm around his torso. She looked at me and I knew her face mirrored my own confusion and concern. She then whispered something into Father's ear and took Anne Mary with her into the spare room, the makeshift nursery. Sniffling, my father took his hands from his face, which was now damp and lined, wiped his nose with his sleeve and kneeled down beside me. "Cadian," he croaked in a trembling voice. "That wasn't your aunt. That woman's name was Danny Mulville, or Danny Bryce. She wasn't my sister, she was my wife. My first wife before I met your mother." He then proceeded to tell me about the long story of how they had married back in Jamaica when they were both only teenagers and how Father had decided to move to England to start a new life. He didn't tell me at the time, but I would find out later they never properly divorced. That was 40 years ago and he had never returned. It didn't take too long for her to eventually find us since my mom posts everything online and eventually Danny stumbled over our happy little family and figured out where we were living. My father had actually been receiving threatening emails at work from some account he didn't recognize as well as threatening phone calls from unlisted numbers. After what happened, he figured out all of them were connected to her. "Probably, the reason I had to cut my trip short," he said presently, "was because they found Danny's body yesterday in a car just 3 kilometers from your school. I had to identify her with your mom." What my father didn't tell me was that Danny was found with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. When they arrived at the morgue to identify her body, they were not just met by the coroner, but also a city homicide inspector and a patrolman. They said the handgun looked like it had been stored inside her shawl as there was a holster strapped on her waist. I felt sick when I found that out. The gun must have been what she'd been reaching for when she decided instead to take out a cigarette. Disturbingly, that wasn't all they found. Inside her car were a butcher knife, a roll of duct tape, a bottle of chloroform, and a coil of laid rope. I'm quite certain now what would have happened to me had I gotten into that blue car. And I find it terrifying that she chose to come after me, specifically. What I'll never know, however, was why she changed her mind. Story 8, Something Replaced My Best Friend. Let me preface all of this by giving you some insight into my relationship with my best friend, and just my life in general leading up to this point. I'm a 23-year-old male, and I've recently moved out of my mother's house. I moved to a very small apartment with my dog, Rocco. He was a 10-year-old Schnauzer, and he was my best friend. Now, I didn't have Rocco for very long. He was passed on to me from a different owner about 4 years ago, and it took us some time to get used to each other's company. But seeing as though I didn't have a job to speak of and I was a college dropout living in mom's basement, we had a lot of time to bond. I spent hours laying in bed with him, relaying to him whatever insignificant things happened to me during the day, knowing that he couldn't understand a single word. But he'd lick my face and curl up next to me. That's gotta mean yeah man, been there done that in dog language, right? Anyway, I got a small retail job and I had been saving up for a while. I want my life to go somewhere, and even though my passion is making art, it's not nearly enough to pay for bills as it is. Especially not enough to supply for your highness. I mean, Rocco's needs. I should probably mention he was really picky about food. I almost considered leaving him behind when I was getting to move out, but I couldn't. Not when he'd stare at me with those big, droopy black eyes and bark his lungs out if I so much as stepped outside of the house for 30 seconds to take out the trash. He had been essentially abandoned once already, and I wasn't gonna put him through that again. I would have trusted Mom to care for him, but she barely has time to herself. This one was on me. Fast forward a couple of months and we're all set in our new home. It's a small one-bedroom apartment, 1 bathroom, a kitchen and a tiny living room space. It wasn't much, but it was all I could afford at the time, and I certainly didn't ask for much as long as I had Rocco, and a stable Wi-Fi connection. Our days went on seemingly normal for a couple of weeks. I kept at my job and Rocco would cause some disturbance whenever I had to leave. He'd bark for a couple of minutes and then calm down. The neighbors didn't seem to complain all too much, though. Well, it's not like the place was packed. I should have also probably mentioned this earlier, but the rooms were weirdly empty. It had 5 floors and about 20 rooms, but only like 5 of those were occupied, and I've never really seen my neighbors. I hear noises in the dead of night, though. No, not blood-curdling screams or banging on the walls, just faint noises that I shrug off as rustling of sheets or TV static. In hindsight, this should have been my first red flag, but it was one of the only places that let me have pets. The rules were pretty flexible and the price was serviceable for my tight budget. One morning, I left for work as usual, and throughout my routine, Rocco was of course barking at me and tugging at my pants as if begging me to stay. This was already pretty standard, but something just felt off about him. I looked down at him, ready to scold him and shake him off, but he had a legitimate look of terror in his eyes. One that I hadn't seen before, and it made my skin crawl. I gently kissed him on the head and whispered that I'd be back in no time, sighed and closed the door as I left, the sounds of his barking growing faint as I went down the stairs. As I was getting into my car, I saw one of my neighbors for the first time since I had moved there almost a month ago at this point. I was so shocked to have human interaction that I struggled to even form a coherent sentence, but I managed to utter an overly enthusiastic "Hey, morning," to which the young lady taking her poodle out for a walk waved at me. She seemed equally shocked that there were other actual human life forms in the building. She told me her name was Jay, and her poodle's name was Jet. That was unfortunately the most I could get out of her as I was running late for work. I hopped in my car and waved goodbye, hoping to see her later that day. As I drove there, however, I just couldn't shake off that look in Rocco's face. I could barely get through my workday without getting distracted. I went through the motions as quickly as possible. I needed to get back to him. Soon enough, my shift was over. I bought some instant noodles and got back to my apartment. I forgot to ask for Jay's room number, so I couldn't really stop by to say hi. My priority was getting to Rocco, anyways, but as soon as I stepped into that apartment I noticed things were off. You see, whenever I came home, Rocco would run across the room and lunges at me. He'd tackle me to the floor if he wasn't so small. But today, that didn't happen. Whatever, he must be sleeping, I thought. I went into the bedroom and alas, there he was, curled up and sound asleep on my bed. When I called him, however, he ignored me completely. He did that sometimes, but no matter how hard I tried I couldn't get his attention. I gave up and half-heartedly dropped some dog food on his tray, ate my noodles and dozed off to take a nap on the couch. I woke up hours later, and my heart skipped a beat. Rocco was right at the edge of the couch, staring me dead in the eye. Normally I wouldn't be so shocked. He sometimes nudged me in my sleep or simply curled up next to me. But it was strange for him to just be standing there, in complete stillness, looking at me with such lifeless eyes. Maybe it was his way of apologizing for being a dick to me earlier? Yeah, sure. I forced myself to go with that because I really needed to shrug that sight off. You might think I'm overreacting, but I simply can't put it into words. The next few days weren't any better. The next morning he didn't bark or cry as I was getting ready to leave for work. The peaceful quietness was disturbing. Downstairs I found Jay again, but this time she was by herself having a smoke. I asked what was wrong, and where Jet was. She told me Jet had been acting really strange and wouldn't respond to her name or even look at her. She hadn't been eating for days either. I told her about my similar experiences with Rocco, and we decided it was way too much of a coincidence, but we really couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation. I got her room number and her phone this time, so we would update each other. I left for work and went about my day normally. I got home, and again, Rocco didn't even acknowledge my presence. He was sitting in the middle of the living room, completely still, as if he was a marble statue. I did my best to avoid looking at him. Something about that dead stillness made me feel queasy. I couldn't even notice him blinking, or breathing. I lost my appetite and I headed straight to bed, and cried myself to sleep. I'd be embarrassed to admit it, but I was distressed. Whatever was in my room with me. It wasn't Rocco. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know where my buddy had gone. All I knew was that this was all wrong, and I needed answers. I called in sick for work the next day. I then called my landlord and told him about my situation. To say he wasn't of any help would be an understatement, but I wasn't really expecting much. I met with Jay later that day, and what she had to tell me didn't help ease my nerves. Jet had switched from not acknowledging her presence to being downright aggressive whenever Jay was in her general vicinity, barking and snarling at her. We decided to drive both of our dogs to the vet that same day. We needed the opinion of an expert in the field before jumping to unreasonable conclusions. It didn't work out. As soon as I tried to lay a hand on Rocco, he barked loudly and aggressively, just the way Jay described to me. I did my best to calm him down, but he lunged at me and actually managed to tackle me down to the floor. I was absolutely shocked. Never before had he shown such strength before. Keep in mind he's not even half my size and I'm a pretty tall, stocky guy. He then just stared at me, like he did before, snarling angrily as if he was about to go in for the kill. But he just hopped off and walked away to the bedroom. I was sweating and my heart was racing. I wasn't even gonna try to get him off my bed. I'd rather sleep on the kitchen floor. And so I did. I felt like a prisoner in my own new home. That thing was not my dog, and it hated me. It really hated me. Needless to say, I didn't go to work the next day either. This time I didn't even give them a call. I was just too shaken up. I took a cold shower, had some leftovers for lunch and tried to figure out where to go from there. Rocco had since gotten up from my bed and was now staring straight at me from across the room. Every time my eyes met with that thing's, I felt tears swelling up. What in the hell happened to my only friend? Where is he and what is this thing in my bedroom? I snapped it out of it when I heard screaming from upstairs. Immediately, I knew it was coming from Jay's room. I bolted up the stairs and knocked frantically on the door, calling out Jay's name to no avail. I knocked on every door on that floor screaming for help and not a single person responded. It was as if I was completely alone. I couldn't even hear a noise coming from inside. Jay's room was locked, and I had to slam my body repeatedly against the door until it came down. The rotten stench hit me like a ton of bricks. I suppressed the urge to vomit and held my nose, my eyes watering and stomach turning. "Jay?" I yelled as I walked in, barely able to see through my tears. I stepped on something sticky, wet. The sight that greeted me was nothing short of a nightmare. There was some kind of gooey, clear liquid splattered across the walls and all over Jay's furniture in unnatural patterns, as if something had just burst open in the middle of the room. On the ground, I saw a mangled mess of white fur and blood. I assumed that to be Jet's remains. Or at least, whatever it was that took the form of Jet. There's no way in hell that thing was a dog, or even any creature known to me. I gagged, but I ran in looking for Jay, fearing the worst. I sighed in relief as I saw her in the bathroom, but she was in a near catatonic state. Her eyes were blank, wide open, she was trembling and curled up in a fetal position, rocking back and forth without saying a word. On her neck, she had a deep red bite mark. I figured it was Jet's doing, but there was no way a pup her size could have inflicted such a wound. I tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't respond to anything. I had to prop her up on my back and run downstairs to my car. I was gonna flee right then and there, but my keys were in my apartment. I set her down and ran back to my room, dreading whatever was waiting for me when I opened the door. At this point, I had accepted that I would not be seeing Rocco ever again, and whatever was inside my room was not my friend. Whatever I had to do to survive, I would, no matter how much it looked like Rocco. I opened the door and it was dead silence. It was already dark outside and the room was almost pitch black. The very same stench I felt in Jay's room was now coming from mine. Carefully, I walked in and felt that same, gooey liquid under my feet. I held my breath and kept going. The keys were on the nightstand in my bedroom, and the creature that was impersonating my dog might very well be waiting for me right there. I was as quiet as humanly possible. The thing was curled up in my bed, sound asleep. It was snoring peacefully, and for a second, I almost thought I had him back. I had to suppress tears as I knew very well that it wasn't Rocco. It would never be Rocco, no matter how hard it tried to imitate him. I grabbed my keys, and bolted out the door. Behind me, I could hear what vaguely resembled barking, but it sounded otherworldly. It sounded like yelling, like crying, and that's when I was reminded that it wasn't my buddy that I was leaving behind. I didn't dare to look back at the abomination as it kept on wailing. I got to my car, propped Jay up on the passenger's seat and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't look back once. I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders, and I didn't hold back my tears anymore. I checked into a motel with Jay and here I am, typing all of this out to you. I miss Rocco. I'm gonna miss him so much. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know who or what took him. I don't know what it was that took Jay's dog either, but I don't think I want to know the answers either. Somehow, maybe, I'll be able to put this past me. I thought maybe typing it all out would make it easier to digest and accept. So far, it hasn't. I'm gonna head to bed now. I'm taking Jay to the doctor tomorrow. That wound on her neck is looking really ugly and it's starting to bulge. She's been staring dead at me the whole time I've been typing this, too. She must still be in shock. Good night, everyone. And good night to my buddy, wherever he is. Story 9, has anyone heard about the Land of Grey? My grandpa was a peculiar man to say the least. My mum would call him eccentric and my dad would call him downright crazy, but even so he had always been a close member of our family. Don't get me wrong, he was a thoroughly good man who never did anything to hurt us physically or emotionally. He cared more than any person I'd ever met, not only about us but about everyone, even strangers on the street. Safe to say we all loved him, but sadly, as life goes on, people eventually grow too old and their bodies give out. My dear grandpa was no exception to this rule, and a few years ago he succumbed to age. It was a peaceful passing with all of us at his side, and he without a doubt left this world a better place. He did however turn a bit odd as the years passed, even stranger than he had always been. During our last few conversations he would tell me that I should never visit the land of grey. He would refuse to elaborate on the matter, saying I wasn't ready to know, and then he changed the subject. As time went on I completely forgot about his warnings of the grey place, and simply cherished the memories. That was until I turned 21 and received a wooden box. It had belonged to my grandpa and I remembered seeing it in his attic a few times. Apparently he had instructed in his will that I get it after I turned 21, being an adult and all. Most of the stuff was just old junk, but there were a couple of medals he earned from his service during World War II. He had served on the American side as a pilot, despite being of German ancestry. He already had a basic pilot's license, so he thought it was a neat way of helping his new country without having to face any serious battle. There was also a leather-bound journal inside the box. I figured it must have been some kind of diary he had kept in his younger years, as it appeared quite torn. I was initially hesitant to open it, as it seemed a bit personal even for me to read, but since he had decided I should inherit it, there must have been something inside he wanted me to read. So I opened it gently to check out the first page. It was all written in German, but he had signed his name as Frederick Walker, which was a name he used after the war to appear more American, so I knew it wasn't from his service time. The title on the first page read The Land of Grey. Below is my best attempt at translating the contents of the journal. His way of speaking German was quite old-fashioned, and myself I only speak enough to get by, taught mostly by my family, but with a little help from our good friend Google Translate I hope it makes sense. Today was the first time I sat on a commercial flight. In fact, it's the first time since I got my license I am able to ride in a plane not as a pilot, but as a passenger. I was astonished by the interior on the plane, so open and well decorated, a welcome difference from the cold metal cages I saw inside military aircraft. The seats were now luxury chairs and every passenger had dressed up as if going to a gala. It's only thanks to my job that I am able to travel in such a manner. Working as a translator means I have to travel to new places efficiently, and the company does not hesitate to foot the bill. Even the engine on the plane was as silent as a mouse. It was something I thought would annoy me, but people were even able to sleep calmly. On top of it all there were beautiful stewardesses in pretty uniforms serving food to those with hunger, but me myself I was too excited to eat. It was first time I could freely enjoy the view of the world below without having to pay attention to what I was doing. It was a night flight, and the sun had long since set when we boarded the plane. Most of my fellow travelers were accompanied by someone, either a business partner or spouse. They kept themselves busy by either eating or smoking and chatting with their neighbors, and I kept mostly to myself staring out the window. Below us lied brilliant lights from the cities, illuminating the ground even at night. Everything down there seemed so insignificant. It was a wonderful feeling to imagine that each of these lights might house a family with lives of their own and stories to tell. At some point I had drifted off into a comfortable slumber, and when I came back to it everything was bright outside. One of the stewardesses came by to offer me a fresh cup of coffee. She told me we were only a couple of hours from landing. I once again directed my attention to the small world below. We had descended quite a bit and I could see a small town surrounded by a large chain of mountains. It was a rather sad sight. All the buildings seemed too old and worn down, with streets that could barely fit cars driving. Not a single moving soul outside, but even stranger was that everything seemed to lack color, as if something had drained all life from the place. I was absolutely captivated by a feeling of unease as I looked down upon the grey town. My senses became so focused on the place below that everything else was filtered out. The people on the plane became muffled sounds in the background, and the corners of my vision darkened so I could better observe the little town. Then I felt as if I was being pulled from my seat out from the plane. Everything slowed down, and it awoke something ancient and terrifying within me. No sooner had I disconnected from reality, before something snapped me back. A stewardess gently touching my shoulder. She announced to me that people were leaving the plane as we had already landed several minutes ago. I shook my head a bit as to get back into reality and looked out the window again. Sure enough, we were standing peacefully just off the landing strip. For the following few pages he simply talked about how business was progressing, nothing too important, so I'll skip ahead, but there was one paragraph that stuck out. Everything has gone extraordinarily good. My boss is very happy with my work, but despite the love I have for this job, I feel I can't enjoy it. My mind constantly drifts away and I feel disconnected from the world. It feels almost like someone is covering my ears and I can feel the soft rumbling of blood flowing through my veins. Maybe I should visit a doctor when I come back home. That was the last thing he wrote, before he returned home a week later. There's nothing in there about whether he saw a doctor or not. From that point on he would just refer to the disconnections as episodes. Another episode occurred yesterday as I arrived home from a meeting. I entered the kitchen to greet my wife, having bought quite a few wares for dinner. She asked if I had remembered everything, which I naturally had, not being the klutz I am. She then said something about guests coming over and her voice just trailed away as she spoke. Her lips were still moving, but I couldn't hear anything. Only the soft rumbling sound like before, and my vision darkening in the peripheries. As if someone flipped a switch, my senses once again returned to me, but I was no longer standing in the kitchen with my wife. I had somehow moved with no recollection of how or where. I was now in what appeared to be a worn-down living room, with almost no furniture. All I could see was a small shelf with an ancient radio standing on top, and a rocking chair in the center of the room. An elderly lady was sitting quietly in the chair listening to the radio, playing nothing but static. She hadn't even noticed the strange man who had appeared in her room. I gently tried to call out and get her attention without startling her, but she didn't respond, just sat there staring at the radio, which played nothing comprehensible. I moved into her line of sight and got a better view. She was a tiny fragile creature holding on to a thread of life in that chair, just severely damaged by age. Her eyes followed my movement around the room, while the rest of her remained unmoved in her chair. I thought maybe she was senile and couldn't even recognize that I was not supposed to be there. In any case, I thought better than to stick around, so I simply walked out of the house out onto an unfamiliar street. It was a fairly quiet suburban neighborhood with rows of identical houses on each side. All of them painted in a dull and cracking white color, clearly lacking maintenance. There were just a few people wandering on the sidewalks, all of them as fragile and malnourished as the woman had been, wearing clothes that were just rags of their former selves. One of the street signs read Goodman Street, in faded text that was barely visible. The name was one I couldn't recall seeing near where I lived. I tried to talk to one of the men walking down the street, but he simply ignored me and kept moving straight past me. I just wanted to find some place with a phone so I could call home and check if my wife was all right. Then I noticed some taller buildings in the distance, nothing more than 4 floors tall, but I thought it might be a more densely populated area, maybe someone there could help, so I headed over. Sure enough, there were people there, but they were all so tired and slow, everyone just walking in silence, going about their business. There were some generic signs on that street like bank and general store. I decided to enter the general store first and see if they had a phone. The inside was as depressing as the outside, almost every shelf completely rid of wares, only some moldy bread and rotten vegetables lying around. The clerk behind the counter didn't fare any better, looking as skinny as a stick. He was reading a newspaper that lied on the desk, not even noticing me as I entered. "Excuse me, sir?" I tried to get his attention. He looked up at me briefly, and I stared into his soulless eyes for a few moments before he returned to reading his newspaper. I glanced down at what he was reading. It was a heavily torn paper with just one title and text that was too smudged out to read. The title read something along the lines of "Forbidden Another Referendum in Silver Valley." It was clearly English, but the words together made no sense. "Sir, did you hear me?" Once again trying to get his attention, much louder that time. Before I could repeat myself, I was interrupted by a knock on the glass window. Just two, slow consecutive knocks. I looked over to see a woman standing on the other side staring at me. She lifted one finger to her lips, gesturing me to keep quiet, then she just kept staring for a full minute before simply walking away. Being the first person to pay me any attention, I decided to run outside and call out for her. As I did, everyone around me stopped dead in their tracks, turned to me and simply stared. About a dozen tired, emotionless faces looking at me as if I had just committed a murder. I froze in place and remained silent, just checking around me, wondering if they would attack me, but after a moment they all went about their day, just continuing to walk. I noticed then that no one seemed to walk together, everyone was walking alone. They did however walk mostly in the same direction, as if they were heading somewhere. If they were gathering somewhere, maybe I should follow them to figure out what the hell was going on, so I stayed with them, making sure I kept my distance. After a couple of minutes I noticed a green box attached to a lamppost just by the side of the road. It was a payphone. At first I hesitated to walk over. I knew if I spoke a word the crowd would be all over me again, but before I could make up my mind it started ringing. The sound shattered the silence that surrounded us, and I quickly checked around me to see how the people reacted. To my surprise, they just went about their day, kept walking to an unknown location. I didn't think to pick it up the first time it rang, but after the brief pause the next ring arrived much louder, and by the third ring it was already deafening. I knew it was calling out for me, so I picked up the phone. "Hello?" It was the voice of a young boy. He sounded absolutely terrified. I wanted to respond, but I knew even with a single word I would gain unwanted attention. "Can you hear me, mister? I'm all alone," he continued. I was about to answer out of concern, but kept my tongue. He had called me mister before I even spoke. He knew who I was. "I'm so scared, please help me," he pleaded, sulking as he spoke. I quickly looked around me. A few bystanders had started observing me again. "He's watching you," the little boy said. "You don't belong here, yet." I immediately hung up the phone. I had drawn a small crowd by then, but they immediately kept on walking after the phone call ended. I leaned against the payphone, knees almost giving out due to the fear. My hand touched something small on top of it. It was a coin, but none that I could recognize. The text had been scratched away, simply leaving the number 7 and the portrait of a faceless person. The weight was unnaturally heavy, and it couldn't have been larger than a standard 5-cent coin. For minutes I simply observed the coin, and suddenly a voice called out for me. "What do you think, hun?" It was my wife. She was now in front of me, and I was back in the kitchen in my own house. I was speechless, being unable to do anything but to stand there with my mouth gaping. "Everything okay?" she asked. I nodded my head. "Yeah, sounds great." Had I suffered a psychotic break, I thought? Then I noticed I was holding something in my hand. A strange coin. Now that's as much as I have translated so far. The coin my grandpa speaks of was not among the things he left behind, so I don't know if anything in the journal is more than just a fake story, but I'll keep translating and do some more research. If I find anything I'll let you know. Has anyone ever heard about the Land of Grey? Story 10. We always check under our beds for monsters, but what if we actually find one? We all remember that fear in our bedroom when we were younger, don't we? That creeping feeling that something awful was lurking underneath our bed, just waiting for us to fall asleep before it claimed us as its own. I personally used to have my mum check it, then my dad, and then I'd give it one last look before I finally settled down to go to sleep. I always thought, as long as I checked to make sure nothing was there, then I'd be okay, but I never considered what would happen if I ever came face to face with what lurks under there. As a kid, I was too logical for my own good. I was a great problem solver, but I never understood exaggeration or sarcasm. My overthinking brain is what led me to discover what I did that night. I was fascinated by horror stories, but they sent my brain into overdrive. I always thought about how all of these creations that were commonplace in popular culture couldn't just have been the creation of one mind. Ghosts, monsters, aliens, vampires, all that shit. I believed in it all. My mind couldn't fathom the fact that someone had just created them and the world had taken to it, expanding their own stories with the idea of one man. That was my problem with it. After getting my dad to check under my bed, I questioned him, "Dad, where did the stories about monsters hiding under beds come from?" He looked completely stumped. I mean, looking back now, it was a ludicrous question to expect him to answer, but he did his best to reassure me. "I don't know, buddy, they obviously came from a very silly liar because it's not true. There isn't and there never will be a monster under your bed." God. How I wish he'd been right. The night passed and I sat up, reading under torchlight. It was a collection of scary stories and the one I was reading was the story of a werewolf. As it hit about 10 p.m. that was when I first heard it. A little shuffle. A tiny rustling under the bed, barely loud enough to hear. I brushed it off, presumed I'd caught the edge of a page on my book on something and carried on reading. From there on, it seemed to happen every 15 minutes, by the second or third time, I was aware it wasn't me. I closed my book and placed it on my bedside table, leaving the torch on and laid as still as humanly possible on the bed. I ignored itches and pins and needles for about 15 minutes, desperate that the noises could have possibly been me. As I finally started to feel okay, I heard it again. A small rustle, like the sound of something fidgeting. I breathed in all my courage, grabbed my torch and began to move towards the end of the bed. I began the descent, lowering myself down to check under my bed. I twisted the torch and hung myself down. It'd be fine, I did this pretty much every night. I'd get down there, there'd be nothing and I could go to sleep. I met its gaze. It smiled at me, a wide, ear-to-ear grin, revealing large rows of razor-sharp, pin-like teeth. Its face was gaunt, skeletal, inhumane. Its eyes sunk grotesquely into its pale skinny face and pierced mine. The creature under my bed didn't move, it simply remained still, staring at me, fucking smiling at me. I yanked myself up, darted across to the other side of the bed and hung down, hoping the night was playing tricks on me. I was met with the same terrifying gaze. It had somehow twisted to face me in that space of time, its awful eyes gazing into mine. Its smile seemed to widen somehow, but it couldn't possibly be any wider. I didn't sleep that night, funnily enough. I lay still, in the dark, listening to it shuffle and move under my bed. I think I even heard it sigh at one point. I only experienced a night like that 2 or 3 more times in my childhood, but every single time felt like the most awful imaginable circumstance I could possibly be in. But don't worry, the story isn't going to end awfully. I moved on, grew up okay, despite those nights, successfully navigated college, met a woman, got married, had a kid. The creature under my bed had long since slipped my mind as I sat downstairs with my wife, cradling a glass of wine and watching a cheap movie. "Daddy," I heard my son call from upstairs. "Daddy, you need to check under my bed for me. There's nothing up there, buddy." "Don't worry, but Daddy, I can hear some rustling." Story 11, Estate Preparation Report, the 13th of January 2015. Items marked for sale, see estate_sale_matty_grisham.xls. Items marked for disposal, not many. The estate is in surprisingly good shape. One standing mirror, glass shattered, frame in bad shape. Appraiser says it's not worth the cost to refurbish. Mattress/sheets from master bedroom, too heavily stained. Bed frame from master bedroom, solid wood bed frame. All the legs have been destroyed and the frame itself is cracked in several places. A series of tapes. Tapes are of a personal nature. Transcript to follow as a record of the estate. Tape 1, marked the 21st of October 2014. Hey, this is Matty. My therapist said I should start keeping a diary of my dreams as a way to, I don't know, understand them and maybe get them under control someday. My hands are too shaky to write anything down right now, but I want to get this out while it's fresh. I had another night terror. The dream itself was the same as always. I was running through the streets, familiar sights, but I was seeing everything. Frantically. It's hard to explain, but I can feel how my mind is working in the dream. It's almost like it's broken. Shattered, I guess would be more fitting. My eyes can't lock onto any one object for more than a fraction of a second. Nothing gets processed beyond "is this in my way?" And I know for a fact, that something is behind me. In the dream I run and run. Everywhere I go is a place I recognize, but the running between them doesn't ever make sense. I'll blink and be on a different street, stuff like that. Eventually I'll realize that I don't feel the thing following me, and I'll turn. Nothing will be there, and the dream will fade. Then it will inevitably pick back up. The chase continues until I find myself back in my home. I get flashes of different rooms, sometimes rooms that aren't actually in my home. Some kind of basement. Tonight was the same. I woke up screaming, sure something was grabbing me. Eventually I calmed down and sat in bed crying. I heard a noise from the living room and froze. The door flew open and I was right back in the chase. The weird basement, the kitchen, the yard, the corner store. I woke up screaming again. That's the worst part, the waking up. I never know if it's real. The feeling of being in the dream continues, and time after time I find myself back in the chase. It's no different when I finally wake up for real. I still feel the dream all around me. Feel something close. But it eventually fades. I feel it fading now. God, I hope this is real. What time is it? 4:15? Sounds about right. Welp, no more sleep for Matty tonight. Tape ends. Tape 2, marked the 11th of March 2014. Am I awake? God, it's so dark. Scratching sound in background, what's? Hello? There is a scream, it sounds like Matty runs out of the room. About 15 minutes later footsteps are heard running back into the room. The door slams and it sounds like someone runs into the closet. You hear the bedroom door slam open and heavy footsteps move through the room, then out. About 10 minutes later the closet door opens, footsteps move across the room, the bedroom door is closed gently, and you hear someone crawl into the bed and adjust the sheets. 10 minutes later Matty wakes screaming. Ugh, What? Hello? Come on. Okay. Sound of the tape recorder being picked up. Is this already recording? What the foo? Tape ends. DVD 1, marked the 11th of April 2014. First video opens on a shot of Matty leaning into the camera. Camera is set up in a corner of the bedroom. The bedroom door can be seen, but not the closet. Okay, we're going to try video. The last tape was. Anyway. I figure if I can just wake up and start talking, that would best. Plus, if anything happens like it did last night, I want to know about it. I'll kick this back off before bed. First video ends. Second video opens on the bedroom. Matty sighs and walks back to the bed. Wish me luck. Matty tosses and turns for probably an hour before finally appearing to fall asleep. About 10 minutes later she sits up slowly and looks around the room. She walks over to the window and looks out at something, then backs up. No. She runs out of the room. Roughly an hour and a half later she walks back in and lays down. She sleeps until morning, stirring occasionally. She wakes normally, yawns, and seems startled when she sees the camera. Oh yeah. Well, nothing really to report. Had a mild nightmare. Normal being chased stuff. But I seem to have slept pretty well. Didn't wake up anxious. Ugh. She winces as she steps out of bed and inspects her foot. How the hell did I cut my foot? Video ends. DVD 2, marked the 25th of December 2014. Only one video. It begins in Matty's bedroom. She moves from the camera into the bed and settles in. Nights have been pretty quiet recently, and today was a good day. Look, I got new PJs for Christmas. I've been considering stopping the recordings since things seem to have settled down, but I've had long gaps before. Here's hoping this is another uneventful DVD I get to shred. Matty pulls the covers over her and drifts off quickly. Within minutes she wakes screaming. She jumps out of bed and runs for the door, then stops. The door explodes in and Matty is thrown back into the standing mirror. The camera is jostled at this point and the video quality degrades significantly. There is a lot of static and what can be seen is very grainy. Ugh. No. No. You can't have her. Matty appears to crawl across the room. Someone walks into the room, it's impossible to make out who. The figure looks huge, but the image is very distorted. Matty gets to her feet and starts to run for the window. It looks kind of like the video cuts ahead here. In one frame she's starting to run, and in the next she's being held in the air. She is slammed down into the bed, and the figure moved towards the standing mirror. No. Get back. The figure appears to pick up the mirror and hold it over Matty. No. She's mine. The mirror is slammed down onto the bed. It's hard to make out, but it looks like the figure starts pushing down on it. Various crunches and cracking sounds are heard, as well as the sound of Matty screaming. At this point the camera's tripod appears to become unstable and it falls over. Video ends. Story 12, My family is missing. 20 years ago, my wife and I welcomed our first child into the world. Julie was a beautiful baby, born with a full head of curly black hair. She had piercing blue eyes that almost looked like ice. All the nurses said she was one of the prettiest newborns they'd ever seen. Julie was everything to me and we became very close as she got older. She was truly a daddy's little girl and it began affecting my marriage with her mother. When Julie was 10 years old, her mother and I divorced. Julie was devastated by this and blamed herself and I reassured her that it was not. My ex-wife moved across the country and never bothered to come back. Julie and her mother did keep in contact through phone calls, but that was the extent of their relationship for the next 5 years. I didn't think Julie was old enough to go across the country alone and her mother was not a good person, so I kept Julie from visiting her. Julie was always so sad and I could tell she was beginning to resent me for her poor relationship with her mother. When Julie was 15, everything changed. She barely spoke to me and always hid herself in her room. She whined almost constantly about how I'd ruined her life. I felt defeated because I'd tried hard to make sure Julie had everything she'd ever wanted. Julie continued to bother me about visiting her mom and I finally gave in. Her 16th birthday was 2 weeks away and I told her I'd arrange for her to spend it at her mom's house in California. I saw her light up as she eagerly ran to her room. I assumed to call her mom and share the good news. I was not very happy about it, but it was clear that it made Julie happy, so whatever. Her birthday came and I dropped her off at the airport. Things went great and she promised to call when she got to her mom's. Julie had been at her mom's for around 3 days when I got the call from police that she was missing. Neighbors hadn't seen Julie leave the house for days, but did report seeing a suspicious man a few days earlier. They were doing their best to get as much information as they could, but I knew in my heart that she'd never be found. Police gave up after a year of searching. They never found my little princess. That is, until about 2 days ago. It has been 5 years since Julie disappeared and I got a call out of the blue from her mother. My ex-wife said that they had found Julie and that she was okay. My heart all but fell out my arsehole when I heard this news. I was not excited to hear that my little girl had been found, I was terrified. Even worse was the fact that her mother had called me to tell me instead of police. This really unnerved me for a few reasons. I was certain that Julie would never be found and I was ecstatic about it. Her and her mother had made my life miserable since the divorce and I was finally free from both of them. But now I hear Julie's voice on the other end of the line. Hi Daddy. I'll see you soon. And my blood ran cold. You see, I followed Julie to her mother's 5 years ago. I killed her and her mother that night and buried their bodies deep in the woods. Story 13, Nightly Check-ins. My day job consists of typing on a computer all day, followed by a short lunch break and printing things out for some big business in Ohio. You could call it monotonous, and most people would hate it. That's a normal reaction to boring repetition, and if you had asked me 2 months earlier I would have agreed with you. But now it's the only thing I can rely on to keep myself together. It happened months ago, just a small sound of someone barely scraping against my dry door frame that led me to look up from my bed just before I drifted to sleep. The top half of a man's head peeked out from far too high up the doorframe. His eyes, wild and pointing in different directions but somehow felt like both looking at me, instantly froze my muscles. I couldn't see his nose or mouth, but I could tell from the way his cheeks seemed so unnaturally high up on his face, that he was grinning widely. He said and did nothing. Then, he painfully slowly pulled his head back behind the doorframe and out of sight. I tore up the remainder of my house, knife in hand, as I looked for this uninvited soul who stalked my home. The cops were called, but the officer they sent over never found any trace of the guy. By the time it was over, the clock read 2:32, about an hour since I had first seen the man. The boring days of work eventually blended together and it somehow pushed the horrifying thought out of my direct memory. However, I never completely forgot what happened. Getting home early was now something that I pushed off instead of embraced. I tried to always have something to do after work with my friends or family to keep myself away from the menacing atmosphere my home gave off. But it seemed like despite my efforts to push away whatever had terrorized me that one night, the later I got home the more unnerving things got. After a night out with some of my friends, I arrived back at my house and entered the living room, the door shutting loudly behind me. It's almost as if the air got heavier as the sound waves reverberated throughout the wooden boards that made of my home. But it stayed quiet. Even though I felt off-put by the now watchful aura the house gave off, I still found my way to my bedroom and crawled into bed. Shortly after I started drifting off, I picked up on the sound of someone frantically tiptoeing up the stairs, and all the way to my room. I knew who it was. I was so paralyzed with fear that I couldn't even force myself to look at my spectre as he stood in the doorway of my room. Shortly after, I took a glance up and it was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. Again the cops were called and again their investigation of my house turned up nothing. Video cameras were set up in secret locations throughout the house. The next night was uneventful until I climbed into bed. I closed and locked my bedroom door this time, however. At around 1:30 in the morning I once more picked up on the small taps of toes climbing up my staircase. They approached my door and stopped at the entrance. I quietly got out of bed and made my way to the door, careful not to make any noise on my way there. Pressing my ear upright into the door, I couldn't pick up on any noise, so I bent down and attempted to look under the crack of my door, in which I couldn't see anything, but heard the unmistakable sound of heavily breathing. Once more I froze in place, because it was then I realized that whoever was on the other side was bending down to try and see me too, and was listening very carefully to my every move. Absolutely horrified at this revelation, I yelled at whatever was there to get the fuck away from my house, which was then preceded by quick steps back down to the depths of my first floor. The next morning I woke up and immediately tried to open my door. Wouldn't budge. I shoved it as hard as I could and heard a clang from the other side. Looks like someone barricaded the door from the outside. Next I tried to call someone, only to find out that my phone is missing. Actually, looking back on it, half the stuff in my room was missing. My pocket knife, computer, and any other means of outside communication was completely gone. For sure my room had been occupied by someone else other than me last night after the door incident, but rather than dwelling on the fact that whoever had been in my house these past few weeks was moving around my room while I slept, I was just focused on how to get out. I was just starting to think about how far above the ground my window was when something moved around downstairs. It sounded like nervous pacing, like someone anxiously pacing back and forward awaiting something. I yelled out. No answer. The pacing continued and I started prying the window open. I had to get out of there somehow. The whole situation was very confusing in a very bad way. Finally a hellish boom originating from downstairs filled the air, and suddenly the pacing stopped as whatever new presence was in my living room demanded attention just by existing alone. There were a few short moments of silence before I heard the dragging of metal boots grind against my wooden floor. Chains rattled at the side of whatever monstrosity was now in motion just a few feet below me. It was making its way to my staircase, and an unpleasant mental timer started in my head. It would be just a few short moments before whatever hellish thing that moved about my house was at my door. I looked around my small room in a panic, and deciding that trying to barricade my door would be a waste of time, I went back to frantically trying to pry the window open. Adrenaline furiously pumping through my veins, I managed to open it up enough to force myself through as I fell to the ground below. I couldn't remember much through my panicked state, but I do know that moments after I hit the ground, I heard my door frame splinter, followed by chains being dragged throughout my room. I ran and didn't look back. 2 nights later, with the assistance of the police and several volunteers, I went back one last time to that place. The front door was shut, and in fact, locked. After picking the lock, we made our way into the living room. Everything again seemed in place except for a large circular pattern burned deep into the foundation of my floor. Leading away from this pattern, and in the direction of my staircase, were long drag marks that indicated something immensely heavy stomped its way over. Like an exaggerated suit of armor. Step by step we followed the depressions in my ground up to my room. After reaching the top of my steps and turning to my bedroom, we discovered that my door was taken completely off of its hinges and discarded on the carpet below. It's an incomprehensible feeling knowing that a supernatural force wanted so badly to hurt you and take you. However, even more disturbing was checking the tapes my cameras had recorded and finding that whatever had been living with me originally, had too, fled the house for his life. After moving and resuming my job, I spent the next few workdays researching anything I could find for anyone having a similar experience. An uncommon experience it was indeed, but I did manage to find someone else who had gone through something similar to what I went through. He said that over several months he had experienced a former neighbor of his periodically sneaking into his house and watching him as he slept. Upon realizing that he recognized the intruder, he first assumed that his neighbor had experienced some type of psychotic break or something like that, but was more and more worried when his neighbor started expressing more and more inhuman traits when he would see him. Most interesting was the fact that he too had heard metal footsteps drag their way through the house and to his room. The last thing he saw was his neighbor, inside his house, signaling to the unseen giant his whereabouts. The rest of the day I stared at a wall and thought about what it all meant. The best I could come up with was that some type of force invaded the life of an ordinary person, and forced them to stalk me until whatever beast that had been there on my final day in my old house arrives. Just a guess. It's hard to actually understand anything as complex as the supernatural. I think it would actually be healthy for me to just forget the whole thing happened, and move across the country away from that evil, and more importantly, my boring job. But in the unlikely scenario that you find yourself getting stalked, just know that it can always get worse. Story 14, Thin Tim. I don't have a lot of time to write this. Way back, when I was a kid, my grandpa used to tell me about Thin Tim. He was a tall, thin man, who would hide in between the shower curtains and couches and walls, and if you weren't aware of him, he'd get so mad he'd stretch you apart till you were just like him. The only way to keep Thin Tim away was to make sure there was no room for him to hide. I always thought that Thin Tim was something my grandpa made up so that I wouldn't mess with his OCD habits, and that's what my mom would say too. We'd always fold up the shower curtains after showers, make sure there was a good amount of space between the wall and the couch, and anywhere else that a tall, thin man could fit. We'd make sure he wouldn't. I tucked this away, far back into my brain. When I moved out of home, I wasn't around Grandpa, so I was okay. I left the curtains closed and hanging down, and the couches pushed against walls. I told my friends to do whatever they wanted. My place was a mess, but it was comfortable, and I wasn't scared of every move I made. Then, my grandpa died. It was under very strange circumstances. He was perfectly healthy, and then he was dead. On the outside he was fine, except for the whole not alive thing, but on the inside the doctors said it was as if all his organs were string, pulled apart like taffy. Mom had found him, sitting in the living room chair deceased, and was highly inconsolable for a while. She barely answered her phone. So I went home to aid her in healing after something so traumatizing when I noticed that she hadn't been keeping up the facade that had followed us all those years. Grandpa was dead, and we didn't have to worry about Thin Tim. In an awful way, it was heartbreakingly beautiful to be with my mother and not be scared. I was glad he died, even if I wouldn't say it out loud. This evening, I took a shower and then used the bathroom like I usually do afterwards. Right as I stood up, I heard a light scratch on the shower lining. Then a wheeze, "Do you hear me?" I froze in place, my hand on the doorknob. Who was in my bathroom? "Do you see me?" "No, it couldn't be. Why aren't you talking to me?" Thin Tim's disgusting voice breathed, and suddenly any resentment I held towards my grandfather faded away. I opened the door, and shut it, as quietly as I could, and then ran and locked myself in my bedroom. I don't have long. He is so much thinner than I thought. But please, don't let this happen to you. Please don't let Thin Tim have a place to be, after he's done with me. Story 15, Our New Neighbors Are Not Right. I know that neighbors are a sensitive issue for most, but, by the unmoving, since last month I just can't feel at ease at my own place after those two moved in. I live in a fairly peaceful neighborhood, we all know each other by name, most of us grew up together and some of my most precious memories are shared with my neighbors. I mean, when you live in the middle of the Mundo Desert, you learn to depend on the people around you for pretty much everything. I was over the moon to learn that the house next door was finally sold. My childhood friend, Shera, a kick-ass realtor, was the first to give me the news. I personally believe that family is not bound by flesh or blood, but by experiences and intimacy. I was ready to welcome this new neighbor into our lives, into our family. Sure enough, a few weeks later, they moved in. They moved in during the break of dawn. Now, I am not one to judge others on their lifestyle choices, but it is a neighbor's job to be nosy. I couldn't help but to wonder why someone would choose such unorthodox hours to move all their stuff. Still, I had a good feeling about these people. I aligned my obsidian monoliths next to my bed and returned to sleep, deciding I'd bake them a meat pie the moment they settled in. In good Southern fashion, I brought my pie and rang their door. Immediately I could feel a sickening smell from the inside. I can't quite describe it, out of fear my vocabulary isn't extensive enough. That stench housed itself in my nostrils for a while. They opened the door. A couple, both young, none of them had a particularly interesting face, except that they were both incredibly pale, their hair also a pale shade of yellow. I was a bit put off by this, but still tried my best to be polite and warming. After all, family doesn't care about appearances. They welcomed me in and sat me down by the table. The stench was stronger inside the house. I realized it was stronger the closest I was to a tiny white device stuck to the wall. I didn't question, perhaps I didn't want to know. The first thing I noticed about the place was how absurdly sterile it looked. There were no stains, dust, pieces of anything anywhere. Now I don't have the nerves of steel that most of my friends have, but I still pressed on, assuming they were perhaps still trying to settle in. The whole time I was there, I felt like we weren't alone. A slight scratch by the door, a light thump coming from upstairs. Something was there with them and it wanted me to know of its presence. I tried to ignore it and served them my pie, still steaming. I warned them cheerfully not to get their tongues scalded on my family's secret sauce. Both of them mouthed it mechanically, looking at each other for brief moments, before obviously trying to suppress their gag reflex and failing. Still, after this display, they had the nerve to ask me what kind of meat I had used. My smile slowly dissolved into an expression of confusion. Obviously I didn't have an answer for that. What could they have meant? There's only one type of meat. I could feel goosebumps crawling up my spine. I got up, excused myself and left, closing the door behind me. Whatever was hiding in the house must have realized I left, because there was something black looking at me through the main window. I didn't want to see too much of it, but I saw its dark eyes quietly piercing through me. Something behind those eyes was agitated, back and forth, back and forth. I could only catch a glimpse of it, a shadow rapidly moving about. I ran away. I locked myself home. Still gasping for air, I activated my stone circles and stared at the wall for what must have been 5 hours. It's the only sure way to relax at times like this. I was so anxious I unconsciously removed my nails while scratching my walls for the first time in 10 years. I was knocked out of my red trance by my friend, Diane, bumping at my door. Sometimes I'm such a bad friend. With all this I had forgotten Diane was visiting me for our weekly tea and gossip session. I welcomed her in, poured her tea and a slice of rubbleneck cake. Diane has given up her arms long ago. How I envy her. I poured the warm tea into her mouth. Only after some idle chat did I manage to muster the courage to ask her opinion on the new neighbors. She didn't reply. Of course she didn't. She hasn't done that in 10 years. She just has her way of letting us know what she thinks. Her unmoving eyes were clear. She said there was something there, something unknown, and that they couldn't be family. I was distraught, of course. Sure they were weird, maybe even rude, and sure, I thought they were hiding something horrible in that house, but we are all different. I had hoped we could look past our differences and be a small part of something great together. Diane reiterated, they couldn't be family. I asked her for forgiveness. She's such a good friend, she's always been, but ever since the carnation took house in her body she's even better. How I envy her. She assured me the hunt would start soon and that I shouldn't worry. Worrying brings disobedience, unhappiness and misery to me and mine. Diane left, struggling to hoover as she closed the door behind her. I vacantly analyzed the house next to mine, sitting on that hill. Even in the moonless sky that gives all things a natural glow, it still felt ominous. I knew in that moment that Diane was right. I sat back. Looking at the clock, 14 minutes past 26. How time had flown that day. Needless to say, this is the time for the feast. The doorbell rung 3 times and I picked up the box with the assorted meats. The meat man did not reply to my greetings. He never does. After all meat men are forbidden by law to speak. Still, I reason I should always be polite to them. This was a juicy box I noticed. The blood was already soaking deep into my welcome mattress. I noticed the new neighbors hadn't picked their box yet, but something had already gnawed at the card box. I mustn't worry. Diane will be angry. I mustn't worry. The meat exuded the most delicious smell as it squirmed and twitched on the grill. The breeze brought with it the faint sound of faraway screams and panicked prayers from the center of the desert. It was the perfect summer night. But I couldn't relax. It didn't feel right to have someone sitting on the bosom of our family without being a part of it. I wanted them in. But Diane had said. I couldn't disobey Diane. I'm sure the old tall men of the dunes wouldn't be happy with me either. Their howling was particularly loud tonight. They were agitated. Only then did it hit me. The men from the dunes weren't the only ones howling. Something else, something close, was howling too. Something that was right on the other side of the street. I panicked. I mustn't worry. Diane told me not to worry. The meat gave out and fell limp on burning grill. I ran upstairs. My grandmother had left me a book of spells for protection and curses. I opened it, offered it my blood, chose my spell, a cursed one. I fainted for what must have been a few minutes. A devilish, high-pitched scream echoed through the town and woke me up from my sudden slumber. I ran outside, still dizzy with the voices of the accursed running through my head, as is usual when casting a curse. The beast had been slain. I approached it, fearing that it would jump at me at any second, only pretending to be dead to catch me off guard. An elongated snout gave out its last breath, a long tongue spread out on the sand-filled asphalt. Dark as the night, black, thick fur covering it from head to toe. An unsightly beast, I knew. Those large white teeth were obviously meant to cause destruction. Another scream was heard, this one dissolving into anxious sobbing. I looked ahead, it was the pale woman, now crouching on the floor, whimpering. Her partner soon came to. Both seemed shocked at what had come to pass. She asked me what had happened. I held strong to my faith in the unmoving ones and tried to explain as calmly as possible that I had struck down their monster. It was a menace, Diane had agreed to. Still my whole body shook in terror. The woman hysterically cried that it was only a Scottish terrier, the name of a young demon no doubt, the most dangerous kind. She continued that it wouldn't hurt a fly. Diane was right. These people were not to be trusted. They could never be family. The howling of the old men from the dunes grew even heavier. It was almost deafening. The hunt was starting in moments. The unmoving ones rose, covering the moonless night sky, turning it darker and infinity of shades. I always liked the hunt, but I had worried. I had offended the unmoving ones by worrying. Diane the Carnation had warned me. Whatever fate the unmoving ones had for me, I was ready. It all happened so fast. The night sky seemed blindingly bright without the hunt. The hunt was gone, and so was the creepy couple, along with the corpse of their demon terrier. I was not. Even though I had worried, the unmoving ones had spared me. I'm still not completely at ease, even thought a few weeks have gone by. I have faith in our gods and know Diane and the others are keeping us safe. But to think there's a slight chance of this happening ever again. Never be too trustful of your neighbors. Story 16, I can't stop browsing r/nosleep. Read this. This is important. Don't mind my errors. I'm in a rush to complete this before I faint. Or die. Or something, I don't know. But this is serious and not a joke. 5 months ago I was introduced to r/nosleep. 5 months ago, my life changed. So I was looking for something passive to pass my time. That was when my friends told me this subreddit would be great for me. How wrong they were. I started to browse through it. I use Reddit Mobile, and found the stories and the community quite interesting. I thought to myself like an idiot, what a creative bunch of people. Amazing made-up stories. Now I know better. That one night, I was, like you guys, browsing this very subreddit. I forgot what I was reading, but I was halfway through the post when my phone shut down. Weird, I thought to myself. I had just charged it an hour ago. I plugged it in and held the power on button. Nothing happened. A bug perhaps, I told myself. My doubts however told me otherwise. Browsing r/nosleep at night and having something like this happen was a definite omen. I was right. My phone started heating up as if it was on a stove. I dropped it and the screen flashed a blinding white light so impossibly bright I had thought the phone had exploded. Then a soft laugh, barely audible yet clear, rang in my ears. I can still hear that laugh. It was raspy and cold. Before I could react, I felt a piercing pain in my brain, as if someone had stuck a glass shard deep into my head and left it there. It still throbs. It still hurts. I don't remember if I screamed or not, or even yelped, because I was more worried about my phone. I picked up my phone to find it cold, almost icy cold in fact. I switched it on to see that it was at 100%. Nothing was wrong with it. But there certainly was still a chill down my spine. And so I opened Reddit to get back to reading the post. And as I read, my thumb kept on scrolling and scrolling, like the many of you right now. Except I clicked off the post and onto the next post. No matter how many upvotes the post got, no matter if it was good or bad. I just kept scrolling and clicking in the next post and scrolling. I was intrigued by every post. Every post burned itself into my head like it branded my brain. Soon it wasn't just a form of addiction. It had become an obsession. I've come too far and it's too late to turn back now. Every post I read makes me feel accomplished. And every post I read makes me want to read more. I don't know why this is so, but it's definitely got to do something with the incident I just told you about. What's worse is that I'm aware of it. Aware of my obsession, and I just cannot help it. Wherever I go, I'm always with a phone and charger in hand, reading posts on r/nosleep. I cannot get off it. I've quit my job to read posts on this subreddit. I've neglected my friends. I've become a loner staring at a screen, looking at horror posts, but not for the horror but for the pleasure and satisfaction it gives me, and I guess that's a horror within itself. In fact, I get turned on by these posts. A disgusting thing, yes. But now my mind is no longer master of my body. This is a fearful thing that I am living, yet I am powerless to change it. Let me clear your doubts. This is no ordinary addiction. I'm staring at this subreddit all the time. I can't sleep. And that's not a pun or a joke. I cannot sleep. My eyes are open even if my brain tells me to sleep. I am reading these posts like I am brain dead, although I am not. I cross the road to the nearby fast food to eat 2 meals a day and lie on my bed for the rest of the time, lights off, reading No Sleep. Don't ask how I get by. I don't even know myself. It is torture within itself. I'm being serious. The pain of my eyes being dry, the stabbing in my head. I can't take it, yet I cannot take it. It's this vicious cycle that I don't want to be a part of. Sometimes I wish to scream for help, but my throat stays parched and silent. My body aches, but I am trapped in my body and this cruel subreddit. And so here I am now typing this post on the subreddit. I may be cursed to be on this subreddit forever, scrolling and scrolling. And I don't wish for any of you No Sleep readers to have the same fate. Now I don't know what triggered the incident, but I advise you not to take the chance. Don't browse this subreddit at night. Take my warnings here. Don't browse No Sleep constantly. If you really do fear for your life, then let this be the last No Sleep post you read. I'm dead on the inside, forced by myself to read No Sleep posts till the end of my time, no matter if I am eating or sleeping. And I don't wish that happened to you. Also, I am aware of the irony. Writing this long-ass story only to tell you to get off the subreddit. If you are willing to take the risk, go for it. Keep on reading. I wish you luck. If you meet the same fate as I have, I hope you have no regrets in doing so. I know I rushed this out, but I hope it's still readable. Now, I don't know what will happen to me, whether I will stay here staring at my phone for the next few decades or I would slowly cease to exist. But either way, I certainly hope death comes to me swiftly and quickly. Story 17, my roommate moved out, so why is he still here? My roommate Peepo and I have been friends since college. He was always easygoing and funny. Since we both had slightly funny names, we would pretend to be a crime-fighting duo, Norag and Peepo. We developed a number of inside jokes and soon became nearly inseparable. We decided to pool our rent money and together moved into this nice large but old 2-story apartment 2 years ago. It was a great apartment and he was a great roommate. The size of the house gave us our space yet let us hang out together more than ever. The only drawback was the shared bathroom. Time went on and he met this girl named Tina. She was nice, probably a bit boring, but she seemed to care for Peepo. She would wear exclusively conservative dresses and stockings, and while she never said anything about it, I always suspected she was very religious. This sort of girl was a weird choice for Peepo, in my opinion, but he seemed to enjoy her company, so I did my best to stay out of their way. They continued to date for about 7 months until one day Peepo announced to me that he was moving in with her. I was a little disappointed, but I knew this was a big step for him, so I pretended to be excited and helped him pack. On the day he moved out, I helped him get everything to the moving truck. He was in a chipper mood and Tina, while subdued, seemed to be beaming with happiness. When he was ready to take off, I went to give him a half-hug handshake, but he gave me a bear hug and refused to let go for far longer than I felt comfortable for. I razzed him about it, but I also was feeling nostalgic and emotional. Peepo had a bunch of errands to take care of with moving in, so I went out drinking with some work friends, went home, and quickly fell asleep. I woke up the next morning a little groggy. I went to the bathroom and it took me a few minutes to realize something was odd. Peepo's toothbrush, toothpaste, soap, and shampoo were all in the bathroom. I remembered these being packed earlier. I went to his room, which was supposed to be empty, and it had a bed and a dresser. Confused, I went down the stairs, which led directly into the living room. Peepo was sitting on a couch in the corner typing slowly, but methodically on his laptop. Peepo, didn't you move in with Tina? Peepo kept typing. If you want to talk about it, let me know, I said after a while. I assumed something bad happened between him and Tina, and he didn't want to talk about it. I was more than happy to give him his space as I didn't want to deal with his relationship nonsense. Also, Peepo still was paying for the rest of the month of his rent, so it was his right to stay if he wanted. I went to work and when I came back I saw Peepo in the same couch, still slowly typing. Hey, dude. I said. Peepo again did not respond. I decided to take refuge in my room. In the middle of the night I woke up parched and went downstairs to get water. Difficulty sleeping, Norag? I heard Peepo say as I seized before turning on the light. He was still on the couch typing. Are you alright? I asked nervously. Peepo did not respond. I decided to forego the water and return to my room. The next day I woke up and went to the bathroom. I decided to do an experiment and I moved Peepo's toothbrush and toothpaste into the corner of the sink table. I then covered his soap and shampoo with a towel. I wanted to see if he was actually using them. I went downstairs and saw Peepo still on the couch typing. I walked up to him to see if I could peek at what he was writing. As I approached he stopped typing and looked up staring me in the eyes but with no expression or light behind his glare. This is a big enough apartment, surely you can find somewhere else to lurk, he said. His tone was neutral but I felt threatened so I backed away. I went to the kitchen. Normally Peepo would keep the fridge stocked with snacks and drinks, but it was completely empty. The toaster, which he used every day, did not have any fresh crumbs around it to suggest recent use. I went to work. I was inefficient with my time, likely because my mind was preoccupied, and needed to stay late. By the time I returned it was already dark. Peepo was again on the couch, typing. I ignored him and went to the bathroom to get ready for bed. Sure enough, the toothpaste and toothbrush were not moved in the slightest. The towel still draped over his soap and shampoo. He had not used the bathroom once. I finished my business and opened the bathroom door. Peepo was standing inside my room glaring at me. You moved my belongings, he said in an uncharacteristically stilted fashion. I'm sure you would just hate it if I moved yours. He walked down the stairs. I rushed into my bedroom and locked the door. I looked around. It did not seem like he touched anything. Was he threatening me? After a few hours I was able to get to sleep when I heard rustling at my doorknob. I tried to ignore it. I tried to pretend it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then Peepo spoke in a soft but insisting tone. Norag, what did we say about locked doors in this house? Open this door right now. Peepo and I definitely did not have a locked door policy. If we did, that would be strange. I stayed silent as the intensity of the knob rustling increased. After 5 minutes the knob stopped rustling. So you want locked doors in this house? All you had to do was ask. I heard Peepo chuckle as footsteps walked away from my door. I stayed awake the rest of the night. In the morning I put my ears to the door and peeked under the crack in the door. Nothing. I decided to open my door. I looked around the house. While traces of Peepo's things still existed, including the laptop he had been tapping incessantly on, I saw no sign of him. I breathed a sigh of relief, quickly got ready, and headed for work. I am afraid to go back, but I'm not sure what else to do. 1. I think I might try talking to Tina next. 2. Alternatively, I could return to my apartment and try to grab Peepo's laptop. He used the same password for everything, which I knew, so if Peepo wasn't home I could quickly grab it and take a look at what he was writing. In hindsight I should have grabbed it before going to work, but I was not in my right state of mind. Any suggestions? Story 18, The Highlands. Scotland is one of my favourite countries, the Highlands, the lochs, the constant rain. I love the food but mostly I love the friendly people. As I made the long 6-hour drive from Middle England I just enjoyed the constant twisting valley roads, fields of rocky enclaves and colourful heather. Katie sits beside me, she's slept for a few hours now but has woken and she has that tone where she's going to bitch about everything. I wish she could just enjoy the views and be excited for our week away. But no. Here she is. What's this shit? She says, switching the radio station to the one she likes that she knows I can't stand. Are we not there yet? I feel my jaw clenching and my hands tighten on the wheel. We are about 10 minutes away, I say, looking at the sat-nav. And sure enough, within 10 minutes we are pulling up to the cottage I'd booked months ago. It's beautiful but very small. Stone walls and quaint little roof, nestled in its own little valley, sloping hills surround it on all sides, woods behind slope upwards making the trees look taller the further away they are. The drizzle in the air is light and refreshing after being stuck in the car all that time. I stretch my legs and light a cigarette when another car pulls up. "You better not be smoking in the house." "It's no smoking," said the grey-haired woman as she got out of her old green Mini. She introduced herself as the landlady who we had arranged to meet. She gave us a quick tour and handed over the keys. Thankfully Katie likes the place. It's all dark wooden beams, antique roll-top baths and a log fire I had already set about lighting. That night I cook us a meal with things I'd packed, we talked for hours and it was just perfect. We fell asleep in bed and drifted off. Just us a million miles from anywhere. I wake up with a sudden sinking feeling that something isn't right. We all have our survival instincts and as I half sit up I look around the dark room. There's nothing there. I lie back down. I am just in a different unfamiliar place. I cuddle up to Katie feeling reassured at another person being there. I fell back to sleep. My alarm goes off at 8:30 and as always my first thought is that I need a cigarette. I hate this habit. But as soon as I wake I know I have to get up. I swing my legs out of bed, pull on my jeans and t-shirt that looks scruffy all creased. I go down the stairs and unlock the front door. I stand outside and look around at the beautiful highlands. The air is so fresh and crisp unlike that back at home in Birmingham that I swear is 50% traffic fumes. I stub the cigarette out, hacking up the lump of phlegm that had been rattling in my lungs. I slip off my trainers I hadn't bothered to tie and I go into the kitchen and make Katie her morning cup of coffee. I have learned over the years it's best not to even try and conversate with her in a morning. I just make her brew and largely just wait until she decides to talk. Her constant bad moods and a tongue so sharp it sort of kills you inside over years. The saying goes that a jug fills drip by drip. But that can also work in reverse. Stood stirring in the milk I get the strangest feeling again. That something isn't right. Have you ever felt like you are being watched? Or that there's someone stood right behind you? You turn to look but there's nothing there. It was like that. I carry the coffee slowly up and creep into the room. I'll whisper to let her know that it's there, then beat a retreat to my side of the bed. It sounds stupid to be afraid of her but I am. Which when you think about it rationally is stupid. If we were to have a fight, I'd never hit a woman, then I'd win easily. But it's not physical. Well, not often. There was the time she hit me with a bottle. The time she hit me with her fist. But really it's just the meanness. I can't stand it sometimes. I just try and keep from upsetting her. Like walking not on broken glass, but like walking through a minefield blindfolded. With all these thoughts I creep into the room expecting to see her asleep. She's sat bolt upright staring at me. "Here, I made you your coffee. I'll make some breakfast soon," I say and set her drink down and get into bed myself. She doesn't say anything. It's not a good sign. "I'm fucking tired. I couldn't sleep with you up and down in the night going out for cigarettes every few hours or whatever you were doing. Pisses me off," and that was followed by the words that make my hair sink. "I'm in a foul mood now." I try to protest. I didn't get up once in the night. I woke up but didn't go for a fag. "Oh, quit fucking lying. Always fucking lying," she said nastily. I know from years of experience it doesn't matter what I actually did. I might as well have had a full-on rave because today I'm going to take the credit for it. I exhale slowly. The sigh that conveys more feelings than I'd dare to verbalize. It's not so much a few-up sigh as the sort of noise your head might make having been separated from your body via a guillotine. In those last few seconds where your brain functions yet your only thought is that you have been defeated. I say nothing and we sit in silence until I try and break the chill by saying I would drive to the shop that was 10 minutes away and get us something nice for breakfast. She says nothing. I just go. Again I have this sinking feeling that something is bad. But I just ignore it and get up. I pull out of the drive and turn to the right. A car comes past slowly and the guy driving it looks hard at me and beeps his horn. So in my pissed off mood I stare back and beep my horn back at him. Whilst I'd never hit a woman, I could happily punch another man. I drive on. I buy bacon, bread and brown sauce and return to the cottage. Another car is parked on the driveway now. The same car that had been beeping at me. I get out. Feeling quite paranoid, I grab the food and fumble with the keys in the lock and let myself in. My heart plummets through the floor as I am overwhelmed by that bad feeling when I see that same guy I had had a staring match with, sat at the kitchen table. His hands have blood on them and there on the table is a hunting knife. I can't fucking breathe. He turns his head to me. Looks me in the eye. His face is rough and blotchy red like he spends a lot of time out in the harsh weather. He looks at me as he reads my panic. It's done. I trust you have the agreed final payment for completion, and the discussed disposal costs. I nod and go to the rucksack where I had the envelope of money stashed. Story 19, Flight 353. Passengers in boarding group 3, you are welcome to board, came the chipper voice of the gate attendant, booming throughout the environs. I check my pass and then made my way up to the small line waiting to get on. We were flying the red eye so everyone looked a bit worn. I slid my boarding pass over the reader, hearing the reassuring tone accepting it. I made my way down the alley leading to the plane. I did a final check, making sure I hadn't managed to lose anything critical back at the gate. Wallet, keys, backpack, all there. Most of the plane was already settled in by the time I made it on. The lights flickered a few times before settling into a dull yellow glow. I looked at my seat number, 32A. I sighed and began to make my way toward the back. My eyes swiveled from one row of people to the next. Most were contentedly going about the pre-flight ritual, their attention elsewhere. Occasionally someone would look back, our eyes briefly meeting before darting somewhere else. One man simply stared. I glanced away, suddenly finding something of great interest in a different part of the plane before I looked back. Still he stared. He was heavy-set with unkempt grey hair, a grizzle about his maw. His features were otherwise unremarkable save for the dullness in his eyes. Glassy. As I walked past him, his head slowly turned to follow me. He didn't blink. He didn't even seem to breathe. Just simply stared. I cannot even say that he was watching me, for that would require something behind those dull dark eyes. It was as if he was simply present, and his eyes happened to be settled on my as I made my way down the aisle between the seats. When I passed his seat, his arm snaked out, his fingers ever slow slightly grazing my leg as I walked past. I leapt to the side, stumbling into the passenger seated across the aisle. "I'm sorry," I exclaimed, out of sorts and startled. I glanced back at the staring man, and he seemed relieved, a broad smile painted across his face. Finally I found my seat. "Excuse me, I'm just inside by the window there." I pointed to my seat and waited for the elderly lady in 32C to vacate her perch so I could settle in. I quickly shoved my backpack under the seat in front of me and fastened my seatbelt. Once I was safely ensconced in my seat, I finally felt my heart rate begin to dip back down. I rubbed the palm of my hand over the part of my thigh where the stranger had touched me, suppressing a shudder. Sitting up, I craned my neck to look a few rows up to where the man sat. As I looked at him, his head slowly turned, almost to an impossible degree, until he caught my eyes. The same smile was plastered on his face. Frozen there. Not a hair had moved. I collapsed backward, the palm of my hand now furiously scrubbing at the spot on my thigh. The old lady in 32C looked over. "Oh no, did you get something on you?" "No, well we can ask for some club soda once we take off. That helps. I use club soda a lot." She nodded to me. "I didn't get anything on me," I replied, a bit more fiercely than I'd intended. Her eyebrow cocked, a look of concern entered her expression as she wordlessly watched me palm scrape at my thigh. "Nervous about flying?" "No." I took a deep breath. One of the passengers touched me. It was creepy. She frowned at this. "Well, that's not right. People shouldn't be touching you. Not right at all." "Who was it?" I leaned over, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He's 2 rows up. On the across the aisle. 30D. She nodded and then glanced down the aisle. Her face paled and she leaned toward me. He is looking back here. What is he doing? I asked. Smiling, she whispered. A shiver ran up my spine. I cowered behind the row of seats in front of me. Even then, I could feel his smile on me. Feel him looking. The stewardess started the final pre-takeoff checks. Tapping the overhead compartments closed. Ensuring all seat belts were buckled and the chairs were in the upright and locked position. She stopped at 30D. Sir, you'll need to settle down in your chair. I saw her reach out, presumably to offer a guiding touch. It was hard to say, my view was obscured by the seats in front of me. A second later, the attendant fell quiet. She stopped stopping over 30D and stood up, her back rail straight. Slowly and stiffly her head began to turn. As her face came into view, I could see the same smile plastered on her face. As soon as she saw me, she froze in place. Her eyes boring a hole into me. Sweat popped out on my brow as I looked away, trying to sink further down into my chair. Moments later, a second flight attendant came up the aisle from the back of the plane. She reached out to the smiling, staring statue her colleague had become. Jill, are you okay? Her fingers touched Jill's shoulder and then the smile arrived. Moments later, she was staring as well. The woman in 32C was next, teaching out to the attendant frozen in place just beside her. Dear, is there something wrong? She didn't get a chance to finish, her words cut off as she was consumed. I watched in horror as she slowly stiffened and then her head began to turn, as if on a swivel. The smile. The unblinking stare. What do you want? I asked, my breaths coming in shallow puffs. She simply stared. And smiled. Story 20, I hate February 18th. So by the title you can tell I, or my family, hate the particular day of February 18th, also known as my birthday. It all starts on the day of my birth. My mother was suddenly sent into labor with no signs whatsoever. However, she made it into hospital in time and was about to give birth this when it all started. I came out head first but on my way out my neck got trapped and I started suffocating. I was about to fall unconscious when doctors pulled me out, into another room and slapped an oxygen mask on me. My mother, relieved I made it, suddenly felt another pain and without warning gave birth to my brother. Most doctors had left but those that were still there picked up my brother and did all the jazz you have to do when you're born. Sadly, my brother passed away that night leaving me to have a brother I never got to see. Fast forward to when I was 4, I started speaking loudly and was struggling to hear. When I was checked I was told I had gone deaf in my left ear and would have to surgery within the next year or so. Eventually, I have the surgery that I needed and went on to live happily. Until my 5th birthday. Me, my mum and dad were driving to my party when we were on a roundabout. Just as we were going round a car drove in front of us, causing us to smash into the center. My mum broke her collarbone, my dad broke his right arm and I cracked my head open across my forehead. We were sent to the hospital where I had to get 8 stitches and stayed for the night at a friend's house for the next week while my mum and dad healed up. Skip to when I was 12. And, yet again on my birthday, was told on her way back from work my mum's car had popped a wheel while on an icy turn and causing it to flip over, killing her nearly immediately. Devastated, my dad told me that he was going to have to look after me solo and was going to be working more hours so he could afford to pay the bills. Of course, I told him it was fine and that I could help around the house to take a job of his hands. The next tragedy happened when I had just turned 20. I was out having a party to celebrate my birthday, sitting in a seat where I could just about see the TV behind the bar where the bartender was standing with the remote flicking through the channels, where on the local news there was a red and yellow strip at the bottom of the page, signifying there was a fire. I asked her to change it back to the local news to see an apartment on fire, my apartment on fire. The bar went silent as I yelled, "Holy F, that's my apartment." I ran out the door and towards my house to see. Yup, my flat on fire. I teared up as I stood there with my mouth open as all my belongings and everything I cared about was swept away in a matter of minutes. For the next year or so I stayed at my friend's house while constantly working my butt off so I could regain all my belongings. After 5 years of trying, I finally bought a house and bought a car, working at a job I liked that paid well and had great friends. Despite all this, I knew something was bound to happen on my 26th birthday. I woke up, headed to work, only to find out that my work was going into bankruptcy and was going out of business, leaving all of us jobless. Over the next year, I was looking for jobs everywhere and managed to grab one that was pretty much the same as my last one but not paying as much. I was happy though and eventually came to terms with it and made new friends. Currently, I'm writing this on February 17th, so I'm not sure whether something is going to happen, but I guess I can only know by waiting for it, I guess.